Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend. Today's recipe will either be the very best chicken ever done or a very expensive disaster. It's called Chicken the Dutch Way. Thanks for joining us as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. This recipe is from The English Art of Cookery by Richard Briggs. This is 1788. Let me read to you this recipe. It says, fowl or chicken the Dutch way. Take a fowl or chicken, truss it as for boiling, singe it, beat 4 cloves, 4 blades of mace, half a nutmeg fine, chop half a handful of parsley fine with some pepper and salt, mix them together, put them in the inside of the fowl or chicken. Flour it all over, put it into a stew pan, and clarify as much butter as will cover it. Stew it gently for 1 hour, then put it in a china bowl with the butter. Send it up hot. Can you imagine a chicken completely covered in clarified butter and cooked? Again, a very expensive dish, and I just can't imagine what's going to happen to this poor chicken after an hour of cooking in clarified butter. But you know what? We are going to find out. So clarified butter here, we've got a nice big pile of clarified butter. This is maybe half of what we're going to need. We're going to need a lot of clarified butter if we want to put this into a cooking vessel and submerge it in clarified butter. And clarified butter is regular butter that we've heated up and separated out the milk solids. So we want just the butter oil of our butter to cook in. Obviously, if we're kind of pushing that up to a higher temperature, those milk solids will, cook off and do strange things. We don't want that. So we clarify that butter. We just get the butter oil that we're going to be cooking in here. So we're going to create a spice mix that goes inside the bird. We've got salt, pepper, we've got cloves that we're going to crush up along with some mace and some parsley chopped up. And of course, we're not going to forget to put in the nutmeg, which is in every one of these recipes. We've got our spice mix all put together, ready to go inside the bird. It doesn't really call for a lot of anything else going on in here. Obviously, we don't need to butter the inside of the bird because it's going to be completely filled with butter. I'm not going to do anything super fancy with this trussing. We just want to make sure that the legs and the wings are all tucked in and aren't flopping around there. So let's just tie that up. Our bird is all trussed up. This is going to hold together nicely. Our spices are inside. This is going to take a little bit of flouring the outside. I'm not sure exactly, why we're flouring the outside of this, but that's what the recipe calls for. So we're going to make sure that this is done. Put some flour on our bird, top and bottom. I've got a nice coating of flour on the bird here. The directions aren't exact as we get here about what happens. Because the bird is floured, I think what we're going to do is go ahead and have our oil, have our butter, our clarified butter, already heated kind of up to temperature. We're not frying this bird, but since we floured it, we want to kind of cook that in immediately. So we're going to get this butter up to temperature before we put the bird into it. So let's fill this up with, well, not totally fill it up, but get it mostly filled with our butter, and then we can put our bird in as soon as that gets up to heat. So here it is. It's our chicken drowned in butter. This smells really good. I know that cooking fish, maybe lobster, in poaching that in butters, pretty common. I don't know. I've never had it done with chicken. If you've had that, make sure to pop down in the comment section. Tell us about that. I'm intrigued to see just how the flavor turns out on this one, whether a bunch of that butter flavor comes in or, just how that works out. It's really very, very nice and tender. I think you could go crazy with the herbs on the inside. I would put even more in even now, and maybe even do a rub on the outside right before this went in instead of the flour. And maybe that way they were trying to imply that in the recipe. It's like, oh yeah, with the flour and the other things, you could put those spices on the outside. Turned out really, really moist. I mean, it doesn't dry out at all, so it's really, really good. And done to perfection too. That when it's sort of simmered in that really deep butter bath, it's cooked all the way through, but not too far, I don't think. It's really good. So the one thing I'm amazed about, and I was maybe concerned about, was overdoing the butter. So I almost thought it's like maybe this is just going to kind of fall apart and sort of the butter's just going to make it too oily. That's not really that way at all. We didn't get a ton of butter flavor in there. I thought maybe it was going to really capture a lot more of that, but I'm surprised it didn't. But they did say to serve it with the butter. So one of the things I think they really meant to have is almost like that bowl of warm butter that you can dip the chicken into, which I think is really what they're implying by that whole method of serving. And I think that would really help this out a lot. Let's see what a little bit of dark meat from the leg does. Now that's a lot more like what I was expecting. There's a lot more butter around that, and it's dark meat, so it's got the super moist, really. So excellent way to turn this out. A very, very interesting experiment, and definitely turned out a little bit different than I was expecting. Maybe not the best chicken ever, but I think if we had sort of attacked those spices, I think we would get there. And certainly a super moist and actually very easy way to cook this chicken to make it turn out really nice. Pretty much foolproof, really. At the beginning, I said this is either going to be the worst or the best, right? And you know what? I think we actually hit somewhere in the middle. It's a really, really good way to cook a chicken. Probably a little expensive with all this clarified butter, but again, it does work out very, very nice. It does make a very nice chicken that, chicken can either, you can bake it and it can turn out too dry. It's not anything like that. It's very, very good. One of the most common questions on this channel has to do with what kind of food is available in the 18th century that we don't have today in the 21st century. Truly, one of the very most common foods in the 18th century was salt pork. And today, we really, right here in America, don't have anything quite like it at all. If you go to the grocery store, you will find something that is called salt pork, but it's nothing like 18th century salt pork. Imagine a food that everyone in the 18th century is familiar with, whether you're the poorest person or the richest person. It might not be on your table as the very richest person, but you would be very, very familiar with it. It is something that's used by sailors, soldiers, anyone who is doing exploring. Common laborers are going to be eating salt pork all the time. And even in a typical household, it's something that you would prepare for your own family, or you could find it in the marketplace. Imagine something that's so common that the prices are listed in the newspaper like stock prices might be listed today. So, what's the price of salt in Boston? You would be able to find that out in any common newspaper. What is 18th century salt pork? There are many, many descriptions of it, even sort of recipes for it. And I've got this simple recipe, and it is very simple, from 1736. This is Nathaniel Bailey in his Dictionarium Domesticum. And he says, an excellent way of salting meat. Let your meat be fresh and take out all the bleeding arteries, then sprinkle it with common salt and let it lie in the air for 12 hours. But take care to salt the pieces where the arteries are more particularly. Then wipe the meat dry and make some salt very hot over the fire and rub it into the meat very well and lay the pieces of salted meat one upon another, and it will keep for several months. Or with common salt, rub the several pieces of meat briskly with it after the blood is out, and lay salt enough in the hollow places especially, so will you be sure to have your meat sweet, either beef or pork. So this is a simple method here of something that you would do in your house. You might do this in a crock or some other small vessel. But salt pork is also an industrial product that is made in barrels. So thousands and thousands of barrels of salt pork would be prepared every year all around the Western world, and they would be sold into the marketplace to be used by all these different people at different times. So in an industrial setting, you would have a barrel, and many times this was if it's going to go into the marketplace, is going to be something that is regulated by your local government. And so we have the laws, say, for like the colony of New York or Connecticut or Virginia. And they said, well, it has to be a certain size barrel. It has to be 32 gallons. It was the typical size. And you have to have so many pounds of meat in there. So there would be approximately 200 to 220 pounds of pork in that barrel. If it is the highest quality, there can only be so many kinds of cuts here of pork in your barrel. And that's another thing. Salt pork is not a particular cut, like bacon, right? No, it's the entire animal. So you might find feet, legs, front quarters, hind quarters, or a head in the barrel. So the best quality of pork barrel will only have 1 or 2 heads in that barrel. I know, we can't even imagine that today, right? It's like you're gonna open up this barrel, it's gonna have basically the whole hog in there, any of the different pieces you might find inside your barrel. But again, the regulations were there to keep you from opening up that barrel and finding all feet or something like that. We don't want that. So there was a grade, so the top grade only has particular kinds of cuts in it, and the lowest grade is sort of catch as catch can. You don't know what you're going to find. And there was also a grade that had basically the whole hog. You would find pieces of every type in that barrel, but you knew you weren't going to find too many of one kind or another. Salt pork is going to be available in different ways. So you might go to the marketplace and maybe you need an entire barrel or multiple barrels of salt pork. Or there might be situations where truly you don't need more than a week's worth of meat, or maybe you just don't have that much money. So you would buy pieces of salt pork that you could set by. So it isn't just, oh, I have to have an entire, 200 pounds of salt pork, but you could buy smaller pieces as well. Now, researching salt pork can sometimes be difficult because at times salt pork can go under many different names. When you see the word pork, you have to look at the context. Many times it just means salt pork. And if it means fresh pork, it will actually say fresh pork. It also goes by the name of barreled pork, because you can't put fresh pork in a barrel without it going bad. So it's salt pork. And there's something that's very similar and maybe exactly the same thing at times called pickled pork. So we see lots and lots of references for pickled pork in the 18th century also. So it's got all these different names and it shows up in so many different places. So if this is so popular in the 18th century, why is it popular? What's special about salt pork? Well, it has to do with how long it will last. Today, if we go to the grocery store and we buy pork, we have options. We can prepare it immediately, We can put it in the refrigerator as raw pork. We can even freeze it for next week, next year, whatever. They didn't have the options of refrigeration or freezing, so if they purchased fresh pork, it had to be prepared immediately. Depending on the atmosphere or the climate where you're at, you had to prepare it within a day or two, or it was going to go bad and you just throw it out. It would be a complete waste. Salt pork is totally different. At room temperature, it is stable and good for as long as a year. If you buy it, in a barrel and it's sealed up, it can be good easily for a year. If it's out of the barrel and you're buying an individual piece, well, it's still going to be good for a week or two, depending on how you store it. But that's an incredible difference between this piece of meat going bad in basically hours versus something that is shelf stable for up to a year. That is a tremendous advantage. So today we might think of like salt pork, it kind of tastes weird, it's not as good as fresh pork, so fresh pork should be more expensive. Not true in the 18th century. The longevity of salt pork was so important that your salt pork is going to be worth more, pound for pound, than fresh pork. So if salt pork is very, very popular, the question is does it taste good? Now, one of the reasons why it's popular is because it's longevity. It can stay, stable and not go bad. But is it good? Did they like it? Well, that's an interesting question. People don't necessarily talk so much about whether something is good or bad, but we do have some hints about how desirable it was as something to eat. So one of the other commodities that's being traded right along with salt pork is salt beef. Turns out that salt pork was generally worth more pound for pound than salt beef. Salt beef had a tendency to get very, very hard. So hard that you could carve it like wood. And you had to soak it for a long time. And even after you soaked salt beef for a long time, it still was very, very tough, because that salt just makes the meat tougher. It's not true for pork. One of the very best meats to salt, and you can get away with, and it's still sweet and good, was salt pork. So it was desirable because, it might still not be as good as fresh. It's still much better than other salt provisions like salt beef. So much so that if you look at the rations that are given out to soldiers and sailors, generally a soldier or sailor might be given a pound of beef per day to eat, and the equivalent in pork would be 3/4 of a pound. So you like the pork so much that you're willing to eat less of it. Now, how hard was it to prepare? You take salt pork, you need to soak it. You need to try to get as much salt out as possible. And then you can generally boil it or use it in other dishes as, little portions of meat. But there are times when we find references to people in that 18th century context and they're eating it raw. I know, that is pretty hard to believe. I wouldn't recommend it to anyone today. But if you read in Joseph Plum Martin's memoirs, as he is a Revolutionary War soldier, he talks about one setting where everyone is just so tired after marching all day long and all they have are salt pork provisions that some of the men, they don't care, they just eat it raw. Joseph Plum Martin was one of those that said, I would rather just eat this probably not very tasty salt pork and just go to sleep. He was just so tired. Now, you could not take a piece of salt beef and just eat it raw. It was an impossibility. You would break your teeth. But apparently the salt pork was something that you could cut up easily and chew and digest. So salt pork is prepared in a lot of different places. They were creating barrels and barrels of salt pork in England and in Ireland, all along the eastern seaboard, whether you're up north in New York, Virginia, all these places are creating salt pork and exporting it because it's such a desirable, commodity. You just had to have it. But another place that's kind of interesting is that salt pork was actually coming out of the frontier. So salt pork was one of the first things that you could produce on newly settled land. It might take a while to produce corn as a cash crop, or wheat, or some other item like that. But on the frontier, they could turn hogs loose and they would just forage in the woods, and then you could harvest those and turn them into salt pork and send them down the river in barrels and sell them in the marketplace at, say, New Orleans. So that's one of the first cash crops that's coming out of some place like Kentucky and some of those very, very interior places. Anybody can produce salt pork. It's such a simple process. All you need is the pork and a whole lot of salt and some vessel to store it in. Not all salt pork was made in these giant barrels to be shipped out to a marketplace and bought as an entire 200 pounds of salt. It was prepared in the home in smaller batches for shorter periods of time. So you might go to your local market and you might buy 10 or 15 pounds of pork. Again, you can't use it immediately. You can't cook it all right away. So you might need salt pork to last a week or 2 weeks, just in small batches. Or a couple of great diaries from the 18th century. Here's the diary of Joshua Hempstead. And he says, Thursday the 14th, it's fair. I was at home cutting and salting pork and making a chest for Christopher Darrow. It's a cold day. And so there you go. So he's talking about his diary where they're just doing a small portion of salt pork. This wasn't one of those, I mean, if he was doing barrels and barrels of them, he would have said, oh, this day I did it, and the next day I did it, and the next day. This circumstance, it only took a few hours. Here's Matthew Patton's diary, and his diary is very, very voluminous, wonderful reading here. This is November 30th. I cut up a pork, and my wife salted a barrel full of it in the out cellar, and John got a bushel of Indian corn and a bushel of rye ground at Lieutenant Daniel's mill. So here's a session where we're making a little bit larger portion. This is probably going to last them all winter into next spring. So, and notice the time of year, November 30th. A lot of this harvesting, especially if we're doing larger quantities of it, is going to be done in the very late fall and early winter time. When it's cool outside, the meat isn't going to go off really quickly. So you have some time. We have examples where salt pork is trading hands in communities without necessarily being bought and sold. It's really being traded. So you'll find these interactions with people, I got 5 pounds of salt pork from my neighbor, and then, sometime later I paid them off in some other commodity totally different than that. So we do have salt pork being traded, used almost as currency. As we read about salt pork in the 18th century, we find that there are various regions who thought their salted pork was the best and other people's were inferior. You see that even reflected in some of the laws. So there are laws in New York that talk about the repackaging of salt pork. So one of the things that did happen is you needed to sort of see what's going on with the salt pork at times, so you might unbarrel it and rebarrel it, resalt it, and pick out the pieces that were going bad, especially after the first couple of weeks. So in the New York laws, it says if pork is repackaged and that pork came from someplace else, so maybe barrels of salt pork were coming in from Virginia and it got to New York and we're going to rebarrel that, you couldn't mark the barrel as from New York. You had to say, this is pork from someplace else, because they didn't want their pork to get a bad name, because our pork is the best. Aboard ship, salt pork is one of those things that every sailor is going to be eating during the week. And it seems like almost every account we have of the rations for sailors is very, very similar, whether it's in the merchant marine or whether it's a military naval force. Here's a shipmaster's accountant book, and it's sort of, if you're going to be a shipmaster, here are the typical things that you're going to need to do. And here he talks about the weekly allowance that is given per man. He says, hence the full weekly allowance per man is 7 pounds of biscuit, 1 quart of peas, 7 gallons of beer, that's per week, 3 pints of oatmeal, 2 pounds of pork, and they mean salt pork, 6 ounces of butter, 4 pounds of beef, and 12 ounces of cheese. So that has to be spread out through the entire week, and generally on board ship, those things are given out in a particular schedule. So Tuesday might be beef, and then Thursday is going to be pork. There are going to be some days when meat isn't served at all, but this is very, very typical, and you'll find very similar accounts in just about every memoir, diary, and even the regulations you see for, Congress saying what the naval rations should be. Soldiers in the 18th century are given fresh provisions, fresh meat whenever available. But salt pork is something that's also divvied out, especially at times when men have to go on the march for multiple days at a time. And they would be given their ration ahead of time. Instead of having to provide for these men as they're on the march, before they started the march, they would be given a ration of meat, like 3 or 4 or maybe 5 days worth of meat at that time. Now, that meat is not going to stay good, so you want to give them a salt provision. So they would be given salt provisions at those times so that that meat would be good even 4 and 5 days later. It's not just sailors, it's not just soldiers, but we have people that are trading deep into the interior. And here's a description of sort of voyageurs. This is a book called Travels in Lower Canada from 1797. On setting out, each man is furnished with a certain allowance of salted pork, biscuit, peas, and brandy. The peas and biscuit are boiled with some of the pork into a porridge, and a large vessel full of it is generally kept at the head of the bateau for use of the crew when they stop in the course of the day. So they were making this sort of stew that was available to you all day long, this cold stew of a peas biscuit, which is really just hard bread. They pounded that up and then cooked it with the salt pork. And it was one of those, you need a snack during the day, that's what you're going to eat. One of the most famous examples of using salt pork as an explorer are the Lewis and Clark expedition that goes out into what is now the Western United States in 1805, 1804. They go exploring this whole area, and they knew that there may not be food supplies available for them for maybe days and weeks at a time. So they have to take lots of provisions with them. They take salt pork along. They take salt pork along, and at times they would stop and cache salt pork. They would dig a hole in the ground, bury the salt pork, make a quick note about exactly where they might be able to find it in the future, and then cover it back up and hide it. You would do this in many different situations, different people, hunters and whatnot, because you would need an emergency supply of food that you could go back and find, or maybe even find on your way back from going, months or even years later. You'd come back and find this salt pork. So Lewis and Clark were doing that. It was an important food stock for them when regular food was not available. And there's this wonderful section here in August 12th of 1805. They say, here we halted and we breakfasted on the last of our venison. So that would be fresh deer, having yet a small piece of pork in reserve. So they didn't want to eat this salt pork right away. They were going to use whatever might go bad first. This salt pork might be good for weeks or months, so we're going to keep that in reserve. After eating, we continued on our route through the lower bottom of the main stream along the foot of the mountains on our right. The next day, we killed nothing during the day. We now boiled and ate the remainder of our pork, having yet a little flour and parched meal at the creek. So here it is. They ate their venison first. It could go bad. They kept their pork in reserve. No deer appeared the next day. There was nothing they could find to eat, so they had to eat the last of their salt pork. They were probably getting very worried. You can hear that in the words there. All we have left is a little bit of flour and a little bit of parched corn. They are up against it. They need to find something else. They're out of salt pork. There's a wonderful reference to salt pork in The Bark-Covered House. In his late teens, William Nolan was helping his family pay off the mortgage on their property. And so he was going on long hunting trips. He would be gone for a week, 2 weeks at a time. And he would take along salt pork. Why? Because they got tired of eating venison and they wanted a different flavor and something they could bring along to cook. And again, he needed something, some kind of a provision that wouldn't go bad as he was out into the woods 2 and 3 weeks at a time. As I research food in the 18th century, you just never know when a topic like this is going to take you down paths you just never really thought. It's like any of these other things we research. We don't think twice about salt pork when we see references to it. We read, something going on, a sailor, a soldier in the time period. We don't realize how incredibly important this food item was. And we don't have anything like it today. It's completely gone. It's a flavor that we're missing. We just don't kind of realize we have to try it out to even understand what it would taste like. I love digging deep on a topic like this because it can tell us a lot about what life was like in this time period. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend. Today's recipe is called a sea pie. You might think a sea pie would be full of seafood, but you would be wrong. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. So the recipe today is called a sea pie. Okay, if a sea pie doesn't have seafood in it, why are we gonna call it a sea pie? Well, it's a pie that's made at sea. It's a pie that's made on board ship. It's not for the sailors per se, but for the officers on board ship. Sailors are just gonna have, kind of real plain food. But this is fancy. This is a fancy dish for the officers on board. Here's the trick. How do we bake a pie at sea? That's the problem because ships in the 18th century do not have ovens. So it gets very difficult. I don't know how do you bake a pie in your 18th century ship when you don't have an oven? Well, you don't bake it. You boil your pie. So we're going to be making a boiled pie. I've never done a boiled pie. This ought to be a lot of fun. We don't find, a cookbook all full of sailor recipes, but we do find them showing up in cookbooks now and then. Surprisingly, a sea pie shows up in Amelia Simmons's First American Cookbook from 1797. It says, a sea pie, 4 pounds of flour, 1.5 pounds of butter rolled into a paste, wet with cold water. Basic, plain old pie crust here. Line the pot therewith. So we're gonna line up a pot or a deep dish with pie crust. Then it says, lay in split pigeons, turkey pies, veal, mutton or birds with slices of pork, salt and pepper, dust on flour, doing thus till the pot is full with your ingredients expended. Add 3 pints of water, cover tight with paste, and stew moderately 2.5 hours. Now, this takes some interpretation, just like every recipe does in the 18th century, and luckily there are some other recipes sort of show up and help interpret what's going on with this one. It says stew for 2.5 hours. It does mean boiled. Many times we need a deep dish, a deep pan, because we're doing layers of meat, and generally we have paste in between. So it'll be, we have this whole lined dish, and then we have one kind of meat, and then a layer of paste, and another kind of meat, and a layer of paste, till we get to the very top. We put another layer of paste on the top, and then some of the recipes talking about taking a plate, putting it over the top of that, tying it down tight, and then boiling that whole thing. This is a typical sort of 3-to-1 sort of pie crust. So we have 3 times by weight the amount of flour. Then we do have butter, and we rub this butter in. We want to start off with nice cold butter on this kind of pie crust. And I'm just rubbing it into the flour. I'm trying not to get it too warm. It's nice and cold in here, so that's not really a big problem. Mix it in so it's you don't have big butter lumps in there. So I cut the butter up into little pieces first. And then when it's mixed in there good enough, then we add cold water. Cold water enough to bring it all together into a paste. If you're doing 18th century cooking, you're going to be making a lot of pie crusts, and you might as well get good at it. And they talked about a lot of different kinds of pie crusts in that time period. We're used to just, well, there's just one kind of pie crust. They had hot oil pie crusts, and you'll find a recipe book, even Amelia Simmons. I think there are 3, 4, 5 different sorts of pie crust recipes in there. They're all pretty similar, but don't be afraid of pie crusts. They don't have to be perfect. And this kind of recipe, well, you're going to be boiling it, so it's not going to be light and fluffy anyway. So have fun with pie crusts. They're not that difficult to do. We're going to roll this out, I don't know, not too thin. I kind of want it to be thick in there, but there's plenty here for the dish that we're going to be using. Something happened when I was prepping for this episode, and it doesn't happen very often. In fact, it's never happened to me before, but I was baking or boiling one of these last night. Took all the time to make it exactly like we're doing it here, even boiling it in the same sort of pot and everything. It boiled for an hour and a half. It was great. I took it out. It was hot. It was toward time to go to bed. I thought, well, I'll just set this on our back porch where it will cool off, and I'll check it out in the morning, and then I'll know exactly how it's going to turn out for this episode. This morning I got up, I went out to the back porch to find this, to see how it turned out, and I was like, well, it's not there. And I thought for sure, I put it on the back porch. Maybe I took it out to the German kitchen set here because I needed someplace cool for it. I couldn't find it any place. I looked all over. And finally I put on a set of shoes and I walked out into the woods, and there I found the dish, the plate, everything empty, completely empty, every bit gone. Every molecule of my sea pie, my test sea pie, was gone. Apparently raccoons thought that the sea pie was for them, and so I don't know how this is going to turn out because my test one is gone. We're going to assemble this pie in a deep dish. Can't be in a flat pie pan. We need a nice deep pie pan. We have multiple layers. And we're going to be simplifying this recipe. We're making a smaller version, and we're simplifying it with the kinds of meat here. Really, it seems like almost whatever meat you've got will work in this pie, but you make these layers of different kinds of meat. So you have a variety. This one, we just have ham and chicken thighs that we've taken the bones out of. So we just have a layer of ham, and then a layer of chicken, then a layer of ham, and between each layer, we're going to be putting a layer of the paste. Once this is all put together, we're going to put a plate on top so it holds it nice and firm, and protects it from water. And then we're gonna tie this up so that that plate doesn't come off. So here it is. Here is our sea pie. I've cut it open and it does things that I didn't expect it to. I've been reading about sea pies for years in the Aubrey and Maturin series. There's like 21 books, Napoleon era, seafaring stories, just great books. I can't recommend them enough as historical fiction. It smells really, really good. And the pie dough crust did some, it's not too different than a standard pie crust, so it smells really good. Let's see if we can get some out of here for us. And here's a section. This has a little bit of the chicken, a little bit of the ham, and some of the paste. I love what the texture of the pie dough has done in here. It does some really, really interesting, fun texture things, which, we're not kind of used to. That ham, of course, works really, really well with the chicken, and then we have the salt and pepper. And we have got all these, stacked layers, decks on board a ship, like we would have what they talk about on a sea pie. Boy, this is fun. I'm gonna have to try this much more often. You can see why it shows up even in a cookbook like American Cookery, where not everyone in the 18th century has an oven, but everyone in the 18th century has something they can boil this in. That's the most typical sort of cookery that's going on. And if you have anything in your kitchen to work with, you've got something you can boil even just a little sea pie in, and we can put whatever we want in it. They always have lots of different kinds of meats, and we could probably experiment and put, we could put greens in here if we really wanted to. We could do, whatever we have sort of left over or whatever's in season. This is good. A few months ago, we did a wonderful recipe called a sea pie. And the funny thing was, it didn't have any seafood in it at all. Today's pie is just the opposite. It's very fishy. It's called a saltfish pie. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. Salt is one of the main preservation techniques of the 18th century. They salted beef, they salted pork, they salted vegetables, they salted fruit. But today's recipe is using salt fish. And with any of these salted things, the weird part is, okay, I preserved it, now it's all really, really salty. How do I use it? How do I cook with it? And finding recipes with these salted provisions can be a little odd because generally, they don't talk about that in the cookbooks very much. Today's recipe is a little different. This one uses salt cod. Now, they call it saltfish. Saltfish in the 18th century wasn't always cod, but probably 2/3 of it was salted cod. And most of the salted fish we can still find today, salt cod. Here's the recipe. It's from the Complete Cook, James Jenks, 1769. It does show up in other cookbooks, but I think this one is the best recipe to do for us. It says, lay a side of saltfish in a pan of water till it be tender. Then drain it and lay it upon a dresser. Take off all the skin, Pick the meat clean from the bones, mince it small. Take the crumb of 2 French rolls, cut them in slices, boil them up with a quart of new milk. Break the bread very fine with a spoon, to which put the saltfish minced, a pound of melted butter, 2 spoonfuls of parsley shredded very fine, a grated nutmeg, a little beaten pepper, and 3 spoonfuls of mustard. Mix it all well together, make a good crust, lay the paste all over the dish, and lay in the fish and the other ingredients, cover it up, and bake it an hour. So we can see here that we need to deal with this saltfish. We have to get the salt off of it. We have to sort of soak it for a while because saltfish has salt encrusted all over the outside of it. And we need to get rid of that, as well as sort of leach out some of the salt that's in the flesh, right? So we can change the water a couple times if we need to. We can even sort of let our saltfish soak too long and take out all the saltiness of it. Some recipes say you might need to actually add salt back in it. I haven't had that problem. Salt cod's pretty darn salty. Now this definitely does not cut like fresh fish. Let me tell you, this is very firm flesh on this. After the salting, I think all those fibers kind of lock together, and it doesn't seem to matter just how much soaking you do, it's still kind of tough. Even the recipe says something like soak it till it's tender. Well, it's never gonna get tender like fresh fish. So it definitely takes mincing. This flesh does not just fall apart. You gotta work it. Once I have this all minced up, then we're gonna start working on the bread and the milk part. We have to take that bread and turn it into breadcrumbs and boil it in milk. Our breadcrumbs have boiled in the milk, and this has turned into a wonderful gloopy mess, which is what we're looking for, right? This is what it should turn into, something like a loose oatmeal. Now we have our other ingredients we're gonna add to this, and we have our parsley that I have chopped fine. Directions call for fine chopping, so we want it to be very broken up, and I'm not sure how much I'm gonna put in here, but I wanna see that color, as well as, of course, flavor, the taste of it. This is a boring looking pie with a white fish and, white breadcrumbs, so we want some color in there. We have some pepper that has already been ground up nice and fine, and we can use a good deal of pepper in there. Mustard, something I normally don't put in dishes a lot, but it does show up in the 18th century. We don't know in the recipe whether they're calling for already pre-mixed mustard or ground mustard, but I'm pretty sure in the context that ground mustard is what you want here, not the already prepared like a condiment. So there's our mustard. I think it called for 3 spoonfuls. This is about a half a recipe that we're doing here. It seems like every recipe in the 18th century for a pie makes 2 pies. So we're gonna cut this in half. That was about a spoon and a half. Let's see, we'll mix that up a little bit. We need some nutmeg. Call for a whole nutmeg. We don't need that much nutmeg, but some. That should do it. We don't need a lot of nutmeg in there. We need some melted butter. It calls for a pound of melted butter. Of course, I have here about a half a pound of melted butter. We're starting to get a nice flavorful smell coming out of this. We get the butter, the parsley, the pepper, and even that mustard. Really, really good combination. So I'm excited about seeing where this goes. Before I put the fish in, I want to test it out to see if it got too salty. Yeah, this is uncooked, but you know, it's fish. It's pretty salty. It's not going to need extra salt. Even though this soaked for quite a while, still pretty salty. So yeah, the fish was a little salty. If you want to pull more of that salt out, you need to change the water more often and heat that up just a little bit. You don't want to boil it in water, but if you heat the water up, it'll help dissolve more of that salt out. You can change the water a couple of different times. Different recipes go over that a little bit more than this one. They figured in this recipe, you already knew how to kind of desalt your fish. So, the thing is with this recipe, there's so many more ingredients, all that milk, all the breadcrumbs, some of those other flavors. They're gonna help take the edge off of a little bit too much salt in that. So it's all right if the fish has got a bit of saltiness, because there's so much more to this than just the fish. These are the guts of the pie here. It's ready to go into that. So let me get the pie shell. Our pie is all assembled and it's ready to go. The recipe calls for 1 hour in the oven. If you're doing this in your modern kitchen, I say 350 degrees ought to do it just about right. So let's get this one in the oven and find out what it turns out like. Our pie's out of the oven, and I wanted this to sort of solidify a little bit so it came out as a nice pie piece. We let it cool off, and now it's ready to try out. Now, if you want it to solidify and you want to eat it when it's still warm, then you might want to slice it and then rewarm those pieces a little bit. But I think this is going to be good whether it's hot or cold. Here's our pie, and boy, out of the oven, smelled great. Very tasty if you like fish pie. So I'm having a hard time describing this one because we don't have any really good equivalent in our modern day foods that we have here in North America. The texture is very kind of nice and smooth on the inside. We get a nice fish flavor that comes in with this. The smoothness and the texture mixed with the fish, it's almost like it's mixed with mashed potatoes. I would, if you gave it to me and I didn't know it was breadcrumbs, yeah, I would say maybe mashed potatoes. And then we get this, there's so much of that bread and the milk in there. Truly, it's like a savory bread pudding that's inside of this pie. So it's really kind of good. Now this is eating it cold, and I think it's very, very edible cold, but I think if it was warmed up, it'd be even better. Maybe think about a crab cake pie. I think that might get us close to the idea of what this is like. So today's recipe is a twist on a treat that you probably grew up with at home. Something that was maybe made by your grandmother or something that came out of a package from a store. This recipe is called raspberry dumplings. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. So this recipe is called a raspberry dumpling in this recipe book, but I think we would recognize it by the name of a jelly roll. Now, jelly rolls, if we kind of dig around on the internet, we see that jelly rolls sort of have a history that goes back into the mid-19th century. And of course, as we know, jelly rolls, they are sort of a bread product that has, or maybe cake. And it's rolled up with jelly in the middle. It's a round little roll. We can see the swirl on the inside. They're fun, they look fun. Oh, they're very, very delicious. I've never seen one quite like it in the 18th century, but when I found this recipe, I said, aha, is this the sort of ancestor to the jelly roll? It's not the same in that it's not bready or cakey at all, that outer layer, but it's boiled pie crust. So I wanted to try this out to see if there was a real reason why they changed both sort of the technique and the kind of material they used in this wrapping. Maybe this one is actually better. The recipe comes from the experienced English housekeeper. This is Raffald's book. She started publishing this one in 1769, and it's called To Make Raspberry Dumplings. And it starts off with make a good cold paste. Roll it 1/4 inch thick, spread over it raspberry jam to your own liking. Roll it up and boil it in a cloth 1 hour at least. Take it up, cut it into 5 slices, lay one in the middle and the other 4 around it. Pour a little good melted butter in the dish. Grate fine sugar around the edge of the dish. It is proper for a corner or side for dinner. So she's going into a lot of explanation about even how it should be sort of presented, which is fun. A lot of recipes don't do that. That whole idea of where we want to have 5 slices and we want to put them, we want to arrange them nicely and pour butter in so it's in a little bath and put the sugar around. So it sounds like fun. I'm very, very concerned about the problem of the paste and boiling it. I'm worried that the water is going to get in there and wash all the jelly out. And I don't want to lose the jelly. So we got to be really careful about how we seal all that up. We'll see how that goes as we prepare. But first, we have to make a cold paste. So let's start off with our pie crust. And I'll say just right off the top, don't be scared of pie crust. Pie crust is fun to make. It might not be your first pie crust might not be perfect, but it is not hard and you will get better at it. And it is a wonderful thing to be able to make your own pie crust. It doesn't have to be perfect. And especially if you're going to experiment with any pie crusts, this recipe is probably the very best because it's going to get boiled. It's not going to get baked, so it doesn't have to be light and fluffy. She does in the cookbook say something like make a good cold paste. This isn't the hot paste, which we aren't used to that much in modern cookery because we don't use a boiled butter or a boiled oil. This is a cold paste, so we use cold butter here. So we have a ratio right now of 3:1 in volume. 3 times as much volume of flour as we have butter. So I have approximately 2 cups of flour here and about 1/2 cup of butter. And I've spread it out into, kind of chunked it up. It's cold and it's in little bits. If we could make it even smaller bits, it would be better. I did add a little bit of salt here, mix it in ahead of time. We want a little bit of salt in that. So let's put that butter in here. We're just gonna spread our flour over the top of that butter. We don't want to heat it up. We want it to stay cold. So I'm going to come in here with my fingers and just grab it a little bit and spread it out. What we want to do is get that butter, that cold butter, all the way into our flour without heating it up. So our idea is to keep it as cold as possible. So I just grab it a little bit and spush it and then keep going until it's all spread throughout the flour without getting it all hot. I've got the butter, the cold butter, fully distributed in our flour, and it's looking really good. Now it's time for the water, and we need to add just enough water to bring it to the proper consistency, what you would expect from pie dough. We might do a little bit more than we normally would because, again, this pie dough has to seal, it has to be watertight. If water gets into that, it's just plain gonna mess it up. So let's make a little hole, and we're gonna add a little bit of cold water and then see where it goes. If it really starts to make up to the right consistency right away, then we're good. Maybe we need to add a little bit more water, maybe not. I think this is actually gonna work out. It's feeling pretty good. So we're gonna sprinkle our surface with a little bit of flour. Obviously, if I don't do this, this pie crust is just gonna stick right down to the surface. So make sure to flour it appropriately. Not too thick, but not too thin. We don't want it to stick. Once we've done that, we can just put our ball of our pie crust here. Again, don't handle it too much. You want it to stay cool. So we've got it rolled out. I kind of rolled it out into an oblong because we want to be able to roll it up. And I guess at this point, again, I'm not sure exactly where to go. I haven't done this one before. I think we're going to go ahead and cut this into a nice, very long rectangle, but I think I want pretty regular edges. Since we have to get them to seal, we don't want it to be ragged. Maybe that would leave an opening for the water to get in. We don't want that to happen. So there are the sides. I'm gonna get this end. There we are. We'll leave this, we'll definitely keep this extra so that if we need to sort of patch up anything, we can. Okay, there's our rectangle. I guess it's time to spoon on the raspberry jelly. So we've got our dough all cut and ready to go, rolled out the right distance. I've got the jam or jelly here put in place. And now I have to be careful about how I roll it up. Probably this is the hardest part. First I want to go ahead and I've put the jelly all out to one side. So it goes clear to the edge here, but it's well inside of an inch every place else. This is the very start we're gonna roll so we don't need to have a blank spot here, and I'm just gonna wet the edge with just plain water so that we can start to get a really good seal every place where we want it to be waterproof here. The cloth that we're gonna be boiling in will help us some, but we wanna make sure that it doesn't get inside of our dumpling. So why water? Why am I using water? Well, turns out that flour and water is exactly what old-fashioned wallpaper paste is. This water is going to react with that and turn it into a glue. You could use something like egg whites or egg yolks also, but we don't want to add a kind of an eggy flavor here. The water is going to work, hopefully, perfectly. Now we need to work on rolling this up. So we need to make sure these ends are all sealed up properly. So I'm just gonna pinch them up so all those edges get sealed properly. And I see we got a little bit of problem here on this sort of last flap as it comes over. The jelly was kind of squishing out ahead of it. So I have our extra stuff and I can create a patch. We can patch over the top of that. It might not stick perfectly, but we'll have enough water here that we can patch over that whole thing. Let me get a little water. We have to prepare our cloth for this, and normally on a boiled pudding, especially one like this one where we need to protect the contents, we put our cloth into boiling water and then we flour it. and that will help make it waterproof so that it won't let the water come in. This is our natural linen pudding cloth here, and the natural linen, when it heats up, when it gets wet, it naturally expands and gets tighter, so it'll help make it waterproof, and then that flour will sort of finish the idea. Now it's time to put this roll in the middle and figure out how to tie it up properly. I put the jelly roll at the very edge of this cloth because unlike a normal pudding where we would put it in the dead center and it was a ball and we wrap all the way around it, this one, because it's an oblong like a giant Tootsie Roll, we've got to put it at the edge of the cloth, and then we can start to roll the whole thing up. So there it is, look at that. And we just roll it up, roll it up. Boy, it's going to be waterproof. Wow. Wow, that should work really well. So now we're just going to tie off the ends, and then maybe one in the middle. Maybe we'll kind of do a spiral around the outside. I think we've got this tied up so that it'll work. It's tied up very tightly at the end so that no water can get in. And then I went ahead and went around that center section to keep it from sort of opening up and causing problems. Now it's time for it to go into boiling water. It should go in directly to boiling water, cover the entire part that needs to be boiled. If this end sticks out, it's no problem. And that water needs to stay in a rolling boil for a whole hour. It boiled for an hour. I took it out and I let it cool down. Not all the way cooled down, but most of the way cooled down. I removed that cloth. You have to remove that cloth before it gets stone cold, or you can get it apart. And if you try to move it too quickly, this will be too soft and it'll break apart. So you do have to pick just the right time. I got it out without damaging it. It was so wonderful. Didn't have hardly any leaking going on. So most of the jelly was it was all intact. Water did not infiltrate and cause damage. The great thing is what we're doing here is cooking it at 220 degrees, 212 degrees, right? So it doesn't overcook it. It tends to, leave it in this very interesting cooked texture, which we here in North America aren't probably quite as used to. So boiled puddings aren't something we normally do. But turned out perfect. I let it cool off so that all the way down to a cool room temperature so that we could cut this properly, so that we could display it on the plate exactly like the recipe desired. And it's very beautiful, and it did cut out very well. I was very concerned. Do I need to use a thread? Do I need to, what do I need to do? The pie crust set up firm enough so that I was able to cut it without all of the jelly squishing out, which was what I was worried about. So the real question is, how did it turn out? What is it going to taste like? So here's our chance to try it out. It's very, very good, like you would expect pie crust and raspberry jam to be. How can you mess it up, right? Which is a good thing about a recipe like this. So simple. Almost anyone can do it, and it looks really fun, very beautiful. You can see why you would use it on the table just for its beauty alone, much less this wonderful treat. I went ahead and did the directions like they showed. Let's put some butter in there, let's put some sugar in there, so if you need just a little more sweetness, if the jam just isn't enough for you, there's a little more. And boy, I really enjoy this one. It's too bad that, I just couldn't eat the whole thing because I want to eat the whole thing. So what I was very, very concerned about was texture. What's going to happen when we boil this pie crust dough, which is not something we normally do. And the texture actually turns out very, very fun. It's like the bottom crust of a pie. because when we do the bottom crust of the pie, it has moisture on it all the time. If it's cooked properly, it's not gummy. It has this kind of very firm texture, but not flaky like the top of the pie. Personally, some of the best part of the pie crust for me. I really like that part. And that's what we get all through this on this one. So it's got this great consistent texture, and it's a totally different way. We just don't do anything like this. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend, and today we're going to be doing an 18th century recipe called To Dress Pork Cutlets. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. So it turns out that this area of Indiana is sort of famous for its pork tenderloins. We have these giant pork tenderloins. They pound them out flat, make them just huge, bread them up and make them into sandwiches and all over. So we love that here in this area. And this recipe, well, it's probably as close as you're gonna find in the 18th century. This one's out of the Modern Art of Cookery Improved by Anne Shackelford, a wonderful, fun cookbook. And this one's called To Dress Pork Cutlets. Take the skin off of a loin of pork and cut it into cutlets. Season them with sage, parsley, and thyme cut small. You need some pepper and salt and crumbs of bread. Broil them to a fine brown. Take half a pint of good gravy, a spoonful of made mustard, a piece of butter rolled in flour to thicken it. Shred 2 shallots very fine. Put it to your sauce with a little vinegar. Dish up your cutlets, pour the sauce over them, serve them hot to the table. This sounds really good, and it gives us a chance to use a wonderful Cullis that Ryan made a couple of episodes ago. So let's get our pork cutlets ready. And I've got our spices, a little parsley, I've got some thyme, I've got some sage here, chopped it up very, very fine, as they say in the recipe. And I've got pork cutlets, thankfully, already prepared for us. And we're just gonna put a little bit of this seasoning. I've got several cutlets here, so we don't wanna use it all up. Spread that on the top and press that in nicely. Flip them over. We want some nice spicing in there. We have salt and pepper that goes on also. Got that already pre-ground, ready to go. And now they get breaded with breadcrumbs. We're using nice fresh herbs here, so we got some wonderful scents right off the bat as we haven't even got them cooking yet, and they're already smelling great. So this recipe is called To Dress Pork Cutlets. The cooking methods we're going to adjust a little bit for this recipe because of the conditions we've got here. It's really cold outside, and the fact that we're gonna make this sauce and I wanna actually deglaze the pan. We're gonna go ahead and fry these instead of broil them as it called for in the recipe. They would have just put them on a gridiron and cook them over there like a little charcoal fire. We're gonna go ahead and just fry these up. It'll make it a little bit easier as we do the rest of this recipe. So we're gonna put these in the pan and get them a nice golden brown. We're gonna let our pork chops rest just a little bit. It isn't gonna take too long to get the sauce going. Now, calls for a good gravy, but what we've got here is the Cullis from Ryan's episode a couple of weeks ago, and this Cullis is way over the top. It's like a super good gravy, right? It's already got a lot of amazing flavors in it, and make sure to check out that Cullis episode, because this is a really, really great recipe, and it gives you something to really jumpstart any recipe and make this wonderful thing. And that's the whole idea about the Cullises. They were made to be a wonderful, complex, kind of a heavy sauce, but lots of flavor. And that's what we've got here already. So it's our good gravy. What I wanted to do here is use the pan that we cooked the pork chops in. And that was kind of the secret about why we fried them instead of broiled them as the recipe called for. I wanted some of that pan flavor to go along with this. Now the recipe called for the shallots cut fine kind of later on. I wanted to not have a lot of that raw oniony kind of flavor, so I tossed those in real quick to our pan right after the cutlets came out and just gave them, you know, a quick cooking to take the raw edge off of that. And we can deglaze the pan now. We're gonna put in our Cullis. Let me get this a nice stir. The Cullises like to separate, so gotta give them a nice stir. Boy, this is, you can just smell it. It's just slightly warmed up here and it's just really nice. The recipe calls for a half a pint of that good gravy, so we've got that. And now we need a little bit. Now, the recipe does call for some vinegar, and I've already pre-tasted this, and the Cullis, as it comes from that recipe that Ryan did, already has enough bitterness, acidicness to it. So I don't think we need to add the vinegar in this one. We could, but with this particular Cullis, I don't think we need to do that. It does call for some mustard. It says made mustard, and it means there, of course, mustard that isn't mustard powder or raw mustard, but mustard that's already mixed into a, you know, table mustard, right? So we're gonna use our little spoonful of mustard that goes in there. And the last item that goes in here to thicken it is a ball of butter rubbed with flour. So we've got our butter here, and we are just going to make sure to make it into a ball, all rubbed up with flour. And this is a sort of a primitive roux that will give us a nice thickening for our gravy. Here it is, our dressed pork cutlets with our wonderful, super duper, not just Cullis, but Cullis added plus. So we'll see just where this has gotten to. This is all about the dressing of it. This is all about the sauce. Let's find out how it turned out. Boy. You know, everybody here, you guys can't see them, but they were like, oh, don't mess this up by pouring a sauce on this. It would be great all by itself. No, you want it with this amazing sauce on top of it. This is really good. It took that Cullis, added just a few more flavor notes to it. That mustard is right in there. And those shallots, excellent. This is over the top, really good. I think the blend together on the flavors of the sauce is just right. And with the breading on our pork cutlet, which it called for, gives it just the right little crunch. It gives us this great texture that goes along with the flavor here. It would have been a travesty to have these without this sauce. So this is excellent. Very, very good. I recommend this one anytime. Anytime. You need to try it. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend. It's a beautiful fall day outside. It is harvest time. And for us, it's time for Thanksgiving. So we've got a beautiful 18th century recipe for Thanksgiving. You're gonna love this pumpkin pie. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. The recipe today comes from American Cookery by Amelia Simmons. This is 18th century. This is 1797. And Amelia Simmons has, in this particular cookbook, has an amazing number of Thanksgiving Day recipes. She doesn't call them out for that, but if you want roast turkey recipe, it's in here. If you want a pumpkin pie, yep, you want cranberry sauce, it's in here. It's a wonderful cookbook for this time of year, and it's American cookery. It's the first cookbook printed in America with American recipes, American ingredients, so perfect for this time of year. There are a couple of pumpkin pie recipes in here. Actually, they're called pumpkin puddings, but they're pumpkin pies. There's a squash pudding in here, so there's multiple ones. We're gonna go with pumpkin pie number 2. This one is, the recipe's almost too quick to read. Number 2, 1 quart of milk, 1 pint of pumpkin, 4 eggs, molasses, allspice, ginger, in a crust, bake 1 hour. That's it. That's all there is to it. It couldn't be any easier than that, right? So there are some assumptions in here. If we go back and look at recipe number 1, we find out that the pumpkin is stewed and strained. Now, I did not stew and strain my pumpkin for today's recipe. It works out so much better if you bake the pumpkin instead. If you put it on a baking sheet, bake it for until it's nice and soft. Then it doesn't add a whole bunch of water to the pumpkin, and it makes it just super easy. We can just peel the skin right off of this and then take the internals and mush them up and push them through a strainer, and we get a nice, wonderful pumpkin pulp out of this. Really, really easy to do if you've got a nice small pumpkin, but the pumpkin pulp is very easy to get from the store also, so you can do it either way. Super easy to make. All our ingredients are ready. We can start to mix the internals of our pie together. I'm gonna start off with our pumpkin. Now, she called for a pint of pumpkin. That's enough. This whole recipe is enough to make 2 normal pies. We're only gonna make 1 pie, so I'm gonna cut this in half. So we need about a cup of pumpkin pulp here. And there, that is exactly a cup of pumpkin pulp. So milk is the next ingredient. The recipe calls for 1 quart, so we're gonna put in a pint of milk, and I would make it whole milk if I were you. Next up, 2 eggs, and we're just going to whip these up a little bit first before we toss them in. There we go, our 2 eggs. And that's really all the sort of main ingredients we have here. Now we have spices. And it calls for ginger. Now, of course, there's no amounts. It's all about how rich we want this pie. This is the second pie. The first one had a lot more spices in it. So you can almost kind of judge by what's going on here that there's an inexpensive pie and an expensive pie. So we're doing the inexpensive one, as it were. We're gonna use a good bit of ginger though. It's one of the least expensive spices. And then allspice also, again, one of the lesser expensive spices in our time period. And we're gonna go whole hog here and just put a whole bunch in there. I really wanted to do recipe number 1 because it had nutmeg in it. We're just gonna cheat and we're gonna put nutmeg in this one anyway. As long as you don't tell anybody, it'll be all right. So all the ingredients so far have been just very, very typical in your standard pumpkin pie recipe of today. Maybe molasses isn't something that you've normally put in a pumpkin pie, but that's in this recipe. And we don't have an amount. It's how kind of sweet we want it to be and how much molasses flavor we want to come in here. I'm gonna go with about 1.5 teaspoons. Just a little, there we go. 1.5 teaspoons of molasses. And that should give us a little bit of sweetness, not too much. And let's get this really mixed well. Molasses is also going to help us out with that color. It's going to give us a nice, rich brown color on our pumpkin pie, not, sort of a sickly green-yellow color. We don't want that. Now it's time for our pie crust. Now I've already prepared some pie crust dough here from Amelia Simmons' cookbook. She's got 5 or 6, even I think 7 recipes for different kinds of pie crust. Today, usually we just have, one kind of pie crust. This one has some egg in it, which is not what I usually put in a pie crust, but this will be fun. Let's get this worked out here. I think it's really interesting that she's got multiple kinds of pie crusts. Some of them are for different kinds of dishes, and other ones seem to be maybe a pie crust for a beginner, so it's a simpler way to do it, right? So there's multiple reasons why there's 7 different kinds of pie crust in here. Maybe there are also richer ones, ones that use more expensive ingredients, and then simpler ones. So maybe you don't have all the ingredients for one kind of pie crust and you'll try another one, although they're all very similar. I like pie crust, so I'm gonna make this one kind of thick for our pie. So the filling was sitting there while I was working on the pie crust, and it can kind of want to settle. So make sure to give it a stir before you fill up your pie crust. But our pie crust is all set in our pan. It's got its little crimping all the way around because you want it to look nice. And we've stirred up our filling, so now we can pour it into our pie crust. Our pie is all assembled and ready to go into the oven. Our oven's already fired up, but if you're gonna do this in a modern kitchen, in a modern oven, probably 350 degrees for 45 minutes to an hour or so, you'll start to see, the crust brown up and the custard start to set up. It's not gonna completely set up in the oven. That happens when it comes out and starts to cool, but it should start to at least look like it's setting up. So let's get this one in the oven so we can try it out. Well, our pumpkin pie turned out. It's sliced up very, very nicely. It's still slightly warm, and yet it's still held together exactly like it should have. If we let it cool off, which I didn't want to wait, it would have sliced up even better. Got a wonderful color, smells tremendous, and hopefully the taste is the same on this guy. Nice little custardy consistency on the inside. I think I made the right call with the amount of spices. It's got some nice spiciness to it. Probably not as sweet as you might be used to on a pumpkin pie. Since the sweetener is just the molasses, I didn't put a whole lot in there, because if I did, it'd bring in a whole lot of molasses flavor that maybe I don't want. So it's not too sweet. Normally, I like mine with a lot of, fluffy whipped cream on the top of that, and that can help that. I think it's got a tremendous flavor to it, and the crust turned out great too. I think that's a 10. It's a really good pumpkin pie. Really happy with how that one turned out. This would make, and it's got a, sometimes you get pumpkin pies that have too thick of a consistency, like too hard. This one is light and fluffy, even though it doesn't have some of those things that you would expect to make a pumpkin pie light and fluffy. This one really good. I really like it. So this recipe did not call for the nutmeg, but we put some in anyway, and that definitely was the right call. Could have probably even put in more, because that's really the best part of a pumpkin pie. So don't miss out on the nutmeg in your pumpkin pie. You know, this one is definitely an 18th century pumpkin pie. 1797, Amelia Simmons. She did a tremendous job of giving us a pumpkin pie recipe that we could put in our Thanksgiving Day meal. So hopefully for your Thanksgiving Day meal, you can have one just like this. I'm sure you will enjoy it. Thank you so much for coming along. You know, we try out all kinds of different things, and sometimes they work out, and sometimes maybe not so much. Usually though, they're definitely worth the experiment, and boy, this one is good. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend, and today we're doing a super easy recipe. This is something you can do with your kids. It's very 18th century. These are called cracknels, or let's call them the 18th century version of crackers. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. So what are cracknels? Well, first I want to start off with an 18th century dictionary definition of cracknels. 18th century dictionaries are not like our dictionaries today. They're a little more concise, but this one's good. This one says cracknels, a sort of cakes baked hard so as to crackle under the teeth. So these are crackery, you know, they crackle, right? Now, cracknels are old. They've been around for a long time in English cookery. Probably, you know, they're probably 15th century, you know, recipes for cracknels or something similar to them. And they certainly change throughout time. They get easier to make, thank goodness. But here is a fairly early one. This is like 1706 or something like that. This is the collection of 300 recipes. It's one of our cookbooks. The recipe here is to make cracknels. To a quart of flour, take a pound of butter, half a nutmeg grated. I like this one. I should actually have used this one. Half a nutmeg grated, the yolks of 4 eggs beat with 4 spoonfuls of rose water. Put the nutmeg and the eggs into the flour, wet it into a stiff paste with cold water. Roll in the butter. I have no idea what they mean there. Roll in the butter, make them into shape. Okay, put them into a kettle of boiling water. This is weird. You put them in the kettle of boiling water. When they swim, take them out with a skimmer. Put them into cold water. When they harden, lay them out to dry and bake them on tin plates. So a lot of these early cracknels were put in water, boiled, you know, in water first and then baked. Thank goodness that's not the one we're going to be doing. Kind of reminds me of pretzels or something like that. And this one's very rich. It's got rose water for aromatics along with nutmeg. Seems very confusing. Eggs and whatnot. We're gonna be doing one out of the Rundell cookbook. This is one that's so much easier. So this is probably late 18th century. It's in versus 19th century, or early 18th century. To make cracknels, to a pint of blue milk, put about 2 ounces of butter, a good spoonful of yeast, make it just warm, mix it into as much flour as will make a light dough, roll it out very thin, cut it into long pieces 2 inches broad, prick them well, bake them in a slow oven upon tin plates. So much simpler, and there's no flavoring here, unlike what they were doing with some of these earlier ones, where they were putting spices in. Sometimes they put sugar in them, you know, they do all kinds of things like that. These are just like saltines, right? This super plain. It seems to be more about texture than about flavor. And again, the definition in the dictionary, it was all about the crispness, wasn't it? Didn't say anything about flavor. So we're going to be trying to get this texture, which is a crackling, well, a cracker. So let's get started on this one. Again, this is super simple, and you can do it with the kids. We start off with a pint of blue milk. Easy, right? Blue milk. Okay, I'm taking a guess here, but I think it's a pretty educated guess. We're talking about skimmed milk. It gets referenced a lot in 18th century cookery. I'm not sure if I've seen a reference to blue milk very often, but obviously skimmed milk is sort of blue colored compared to that very opaque whole milk. But we need about a pint. I've got a pint here. And now we have just 2 ounces of butter. We're gonna toss in a cold bit of butter here. If you had warm butter, that would make it a lot easier. So we wanna get this just warm. We don't wanna get it hot, and we don't want it to be cold because we're gonna be adding yeast in here, and we want that yeast to continue to be active. We don't want it to cool off too much or get hot and kill it. But let's get this warmed up. Now it's time to mix our warm milk and butter with our flour. And I don't want to make a giant batch. So I'm going to kind of leave some of this behind. I mean, if we need it later on, we can do that. That's the nice part about some of these recipes. We really don't, we just add as much flour until we get to the right consistency, right? So we've got some flour already in the bowl here. We've got the, the question is nutmeg. That's the question. Okay, so in an earlier recipe I read, they had nutmeg in there, and I think we can get away with it in this recipe. I don't think anybody's gonna, fight us on that, or we're not gonna get in trouble. It said a whole half a nutmeg. We're not gonna do that. We don't want to go crazy. There you go. So let me add just a little bit more flour here. It says here, let's see. Oh yeah, I need the yeast too. While we're still in our nice liquid phase here. Yeast, I've just took some quick yeast and, mixed it with just an ounce or 2 of warm water and just let it set here. In the 18th century, they had liquid yeast from the brewer that they were going to be using for bread or whatnot. We can just use regular, like a third of a packet or whatever. We don't need a lot of yeast, just a little bit. Some of the recipes don't even have it, but we're definitely going to use that. Okay. And there we go. So obviously we can't roll this out yet. We need to add more flour. That's what I like about these 18th century recipes. It's just like, well, add flour until you get there. Okay. There we go. It's mixing up nicely. Dough is perfect. I know you're gonna say, oh, how much flour did you use, John? I have no idea, right? It's all about, just like the recipe, it's like add the flour until you get the right kind of consistency. Does it not stick to my fingers? Perfect. It's just exactly what we want here. Now we need to roll it out very, very thin. So let's get this floured up here and put that there. So we're gonna roll this out nice and thin. Again, there's a lot here. It's like a million crackers. So I probably will not bake all these. Although the nice part about crackers, of course, is that they can store, right? You can store them up and use them much later on. So maybe you do want to make a big batch because it's more efficient that way. And the way these are done actually is very reminiscent to something like hardtack. And if you're not familiar with hardtack, or as we call it in our episode, ship's biscuit, because it's that's really the 18th century term for them. It's similar. Now, it's a very, very simple dough. It doesn't even really have the salt in it or the butter or milk, right? So these are a little richer than a ship's biscuit, but very similar in how it's going to end up. Although these are going to be much more palatable, let me tell you. These are ready to start cutting out. And what does the recipe say? It says, roll out very thin, cut into long pieces 2 inches broad. Now, this kind of reminds me of saltine crackers in that they're kind of done in these little square pieces. And so we're going to cut out these 2-inch broad rectangles or whatever we see fit. Okay, these are rolled out nice and thin. I went ahead and poked them with our fork here so that they don't puff up too much. These are ready to go in the oven, and wow, we've got a choice here. We can do it sort of realistically. I'm gonna put these in at 350 and they'll probably take 15, 20 minutes. Again, we're looking for crispy, but it's not burnt. Most of these recipes really though are calling for a slow oven, a very low and longer cook. Really, we're just trying to get all the moisture out of here, but not like a ship's biscuit where that's basically all we're doing. So maybe if you want to try them the 18th century way, go for 300 degrees. They might take as long as 30 minutes. They might even take twice baking to get them as crispy as we want, but we're gonna try 350, 15 minutes. Crackers are out of the oven. We've let them cool down to room temperature. You want to let them cool or else they won't be crispy. And they look great. It took a little over 15 minutes for these. And some of the ones I had were a little thicker. These are the thinner ones. The thinner ones definitely 15 minutes was good. If they're a little thicker, it might take a little bit longer. That's okay. They each have their own sort of, purpose in life. I went ahead and brought cheese out with these. But one of the interesting recipes says, from the 18th century, these are proper to eat with chocolate. So you could eat this with chocolate. Now, when they mean chocolate in the 18th century, they probably mean hot chocolate, like you would dip them in chocolate. We want to see exactly how these turned out, though. So we're going to try it first with nothing, and let's test them out. Oh, yeah, that's exactly what we're looking for. Nice and crispy. Wonderful little flavor there. Definitely, we put in a little bit of salt. That wasn't necessarily in the recipe. For different, earlier ones, they had sugar in them. So, you can make sweeter ones. You can make them with a little flavor in them. This just has that hint of nutmeg to make them properly 18th century. Do they go well with something else? Well, here's a little bit of cheese. Sets that off perfectly, doesn't it? It gives you the two textures, nice and creamy, and then the crackle pop. Boy, these are fun. Some of the other recipes actually call for glazing them. So if you wanted to get something like, salt crystals that stayed up on top of them, they would get a little glaze with, let's say, an egg wash or something like that over the top of them. Definitely earlier recipes called for them to be in different shapes, not rectangles, but little round shapes or whatever. Isn't that like what, if we go to the store and buy crackers, you can get all kinds of crackers. Flavored ones, sweet ones, in different shapes. They did exactly the same thing with these. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend, and today we're joined by a special guest and good friend, Michael Dragoo, and today we are cooking
Bubble and Squeak.
Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. Today we're doing Bubble and Squeak.
Yep.
Tell me, what is Bubble and Squeak as we know it today, and why did you pick out this particular recipe?
Today it's a mashed potato based recipe. It's simple. It's the veggies, anything leftovers from the week previous. You mix it all together, you put it in the oven or on a stovetop, and that's Bubble and Squeak. 150 years before that, it was a fatty piece of beef and cabbage, and that was it. So it's easy to put together. It's not what you think it is, and that's why I brought it.
Well, it sounds exciting. So we're doing an 18th century version. What's this based off of?
Ann Peckham has a 1767 recipe for Bubble and Squeak.
Okay, so this is going to be fun. Let's get chopping, huh?
First thing we need to do is get the veggies in order, and John's going to start cutting on the onions while I read you the recipe. Take cabbage, boil and drain it. cut it small, and put it into a stew pan with butter, and some young onions cut small. Take some slices of beef that hath been either boiled or roasted, fry them, put them to a little vinegar, pepper, salt, and a spoonful of gravy. Serve it up hot.
As a word problem that most recipes are in the 18th century, this one's a little convoluted and sort of mixed up a little bit. It's a little easier to sort of reinterpret this as cook the vegetables, drain them, put the meat in. So
which cabbage were they thinking? It's an English recipe. English onions are generally white onions or sweet onions. Spanish onions are yellow. So I've got a white onion and I've got more of a leafy cabbage than what we're used to seeing. Once we've got the cabbage chopped, we're going to put it in boiling water and just boil it till it's tender. And Pekka mentions beef. I picked a ribeye. It's a well-marbled piece of beef. Sometimes these recipes will ask for a veiny piece of meat. That just means a lot of sinew, a lot of fat tissue. John's going to cut it into bite-sized pieces. I chose ribeye just because it's going to keep its tenderness. We're going to be frying it in a pan in a little bit, and I didn't want it to dry out. Once again, they don't mention how to prepare it. They're just the assumption is you're going to prepare it the way you know how your family's going to like it.
this cut is a very nice piece of beef. It's going to be very tender. May not have been true for many of the times it was done in the 18th century. It may have been a less expensive cut of beef. And this is hung well and very, very tender, and their meat may have been very tough in that time period. But we can see that by the way the recipe's written, that this likely was a sort of this is a leftover, already pre-roasted.
She's boiling it or roasting it ahead of time. I didn't want to fry it a third way or second or third way and just have it be tough. But these critters in particular were working for a living, and you didn't dispatch them until their lives were done. And so this beef is going to be tough from the get-go, no matter which cut you have. So. Our cabbage is looking great. We're going to take it off the fire and strain it. Our skillet is warming, and now we're going to add butter to be able to sear the beef.
Before we throw this in the pan, we're going to go ahead and salt it and pepper it so that it already has some spicing in it. Unfortunately, this recipe does not include nutmeg, so we are going to restrain ourselves and not put nutmeg in it. Wait, I got it.
No, don't do it. You're not doing it.
No, we're not going to put. See, normally I would put nutmeg in here, but we won't.
Just do it in this. While the beef and cabbage is simmering, I've added a little more salt and pepper. I added some vinegar, apple cider vinegar in this case, and some gravy. Once again, they talk about gravy and they don't necessarily discuss what that means, but in the time period, in the 1700s, 1617 into 1800s, gravy was the drippings from a piece of roasting meat in front of the fire. And one of the things you see all the time in antique malls is these forks and stabbing implements that they were trying to get the juices out of the beef, and then they'd collect it and they'd baste. And although that makes a wonderful crust on the meat, it's a dry piece of beef. So we don't do that today. We sear it to keep the juices in. When we're done, we let it rest 5, 10, 15 minutes. But in the time period, they were collecting the juices, which they called gravy. we come into recipes sometimes where they'll talk about a good gravy, something that's been reinforced with other things. And then that's used sometimes as a spread or as just something else. It can have everything from mushrooms to other pieces of meat, to veggies, to spices and herbs.
We got a couple episodes on that. One, we did a good gravy with you several years ago, and earlier this year, Ryan did an amazing Cullis episode. So definitely check out the Cullis episode for, again, what's going on with gravy.
Yeah.
Great explanations.
Yep. While I was researching this recipe, I came across the 1785 Dictionary of the Vulgar Tongue, and they mentioned bubble and squeak. So that's how I can date it back to at least that point. And they say, quote, bubble and squeak is beef and cabbage fried together. It is so called from its bubbling up and squeaking while over the fire. Now today, we once again, as we mentioned earlier, we think of it as a mashed potato-based dish with all sorts of veggies, whatever you've got in the fridge. And in this time period, it was not the case. Her recipe dates from 1767. This is a reinforcement of that from 1785. So
Yeah.
I brought that because it's interesting and simple. This is easy to make.
Last time you were here, Michael.
Yes. The last time?
Yeah, the last time
Well, that
you were
was
here,
a dark
you
day.
brought stewed crab.
Yeah, it was.
So is this going to be better than stewed crab?
It has to be.
Yeah.
We could be eating it raw. And it
You
would
know,
be
you
better.
did it like it said, and it didn't work
It's
out.
one of the few times I didn't test drive it ahead of
This
time. And I
one-
apologize again.
This smells good, so let's
Yeah.
find out.
All right.
Let's find out. Got
Cabbage,
some cabbage.
beef, salt and pepper,
Yeah.
vinegar, gravy. Yeah, that works.
I'd call this one
That's a success.
good.
This is very good.
And the beef worked out really well. Cabbage has got some great texture.
Yeah.
We got some nice salt and pepper,
Yeah.
and just a hint of nutmeg, which really sets it off.
You talk, I'm going to eat.
So what comes out to you in this dish?
Well, I think I'd recommend a fatty piece of beef. Those fats are melting in the pan, and then they're combining with the gravy. With, in this case, I used beef broth. And the vinegar is an unexpected. I wouldn't have put vinegar in with this dish. I wouldn't have thought of it, and it's excellent. Once again, I don't know what vinegar he's talking about, and maybe a white wine vinegar would be as good as I used apple cider vinegar, because that's what I think more people had.
It's just bringing in the acid flavor. I don't think it really matters.
But it's unexpected, back of the tongue
Right.
kind of hit without being overpowering.
Really, I think the missing component in this one that people would say, oh, I don't know, is the cabbage part. The cabbage is really good in here.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful, inexpensive filler, and it brings in these flavors. Yep. It's really good. Obviously, the meat's going to be good, but the cabbage is surprisingly good. It brings in all those kind of flavors and gives you something to work against.
I would say that when you're making it, pull your cabbage out and strain it right before it's done, because otherwise, if it's in too long, it might be mushy. You want a little crispness without having it be raw.
Yep.
So this is excellent. This is easy, and it's one of my favorite things I've brought. It really is. This is good.
So I've been thinking about this, Michael. You've been coming in as a guest on episodes for 8 years, since 2014.
Once again, I can't apologize enough.
I remember even that first set that was part of the first season, I think, or maybe
Right
it was
after
third
baking.
season. Okay, right,
Yep.
That's right. So we were down at the pond at the
Yeah.
time, that first time, and we did. Let's see, did Scotch eggs?
Yes.
I think the
Meatballs.
pancakes with the
And I made
with the
butter and I made
cream
whipped
and
cream
stuff
at the
in there.
time.
Yeah, oh yeah, great.
Yeah.
It's a couple of great episodes, and you just keep coming back.
Yes. Clearly, I'm having more successes than failures. Yeah, that's right. This is really good. I really appreciate the opportunity. It's surprising how many people connect to all of the videos we've done, you and both of us. I appreciate being your lab rat, experimenting with new things. I was your first interview, first
Yeah.
guest to cook stuff, and I really appreciate it. Almost as much as I appreciate this. It's excellent.
Michael, thank you
Yes.
so much for bringing this recipe in today. This one was really good.
You bet.
It's simple, it's very tasty. Anyone can do this. If you haven't tried it, it's definitely one to try out. It's not very complicated.
Hello and welcome to 18th Century Cooking. My name is Ryan Kerr. This recipe is something that I've wanted to make for years. I'm very excited about it. It's called Cullis. Thank you for joining me today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. The first question is, what is Cullis? And the answer to that is somewhere between a really complex broth and a gravy. You see a lot of different recipes and types of Cullis along the way, but it does seem like all of them turn into this smooth gravy-like broth. And I was super interested in this because I know I've got a lot of friends who are into cooking things from different cultures, and all these different cultures, whether you're working on ramen or some Latin American dishes or what have you, building a super complex base for like a soup base or a broth is important, and it's like, I guess it's a common thread through all these different cultures. And I was really excited to see this as early as the 15th century in English cooking. So I've just been really wanting to dive into it for a long time, and we finally get to. All right, so first things first, we're going to read the recipe. This one is from the English Art of Cookery by Richard Briggs. I love this cookbook. I really hadn't gone deep into this one until recently, and it's just full of really great stuff. This is a recipe called a brown Cullis. Put half a pound of butter into a stew pan, melt it, and put 4 spoonfuls of flour in. Stir it round till it is smooth, then put in 2 quarts of good gravy, a pint of white wine, 6 shallots chopped fine, a bundle of sweet herbs, 1/4 of an ounce of cloves and mace, a little allspice, some essence of ham if you have it, or half a pound of lean ham cut in very small bits, and a lemon cut in 2. Stir it well round, and stew it gently for 1 hour. Season it with cayenne pepper and salt, then rub it through a fine sieve and keep it for use. If you have any fresh mushrooms, cut them small and put in. There we have it. So it is a broth, right? But the butter and the flour let us know that this thing is going to thicken up. We're going to put it through a sieve. That means we're trying to get it as smooth as possible. I think that it's fairly complex, but it's not difficult. So we're just going to take our time. We're going to go through each one of these ingredients and treat them well and get this going. All right, right now we're going to start out by getting the butter and the flour in the pan. Lower heat, we're just going to kind of make a roux out of that. Once that feels like it's blended up nicely, we're going to add our broth and our wine. We'll talk about what that is in a moment, but I want to get this started right now. Our butter and flour in the pan, and they're combining. It's best if you're going to make a roux, maybe get a whisk in there and kind of get that flour all worked into the butter. And after that, we're going to add our good gravy and the wine, okay? And so for the wine, I've just chosen a pretty sweet, not quite dessert wine, but it's not very dry because I want to get some of that sweet flavor in this broth. And then at home, if you're making this, you can just get some beef broth from the grocery store. That's just fine. If you have drippings from meat that you've recently cooked, or if you're kind of planning this out and you will have drippings, use that, as much of that as you can, and then you can use more broth if you need to. But those drippings are really good. You're going to get a lot of flavor from that. So when they say good gravy, it's a little hard sometimes to know exactly what they're talking about. From experimenting around here, the drippings from something that's roasted, that's good stuff. We like to use that as much as we can. Everything that we're supposed to chop up into little bits. And I think that's probably just mainly because they want us to extract as much flavor from every component as we possibly can. So I'm cutting this ham up nice and fine. When we move on to the spices, I've got whole spices, so I'm going to crush those just a little bit in a mortar and pestle to make sure they open up and we can get as much flavor out of them as quickly as possible. We have our broth and our wine in simmering with the butter flour roux, and that's given us a nice bubble. We chopped all of our ham, mushrooms, and shallots very finely, added those, and it kept the boil, so we're doing well. We cut a lemon in half, put that in there. It's gonna give us some nice acid and aromatics. Now it's time to talk about the herbs. Sweet herbs, whatever herbs you have at your disposal that will impart a sweetness and a nice aromatic to this broth, you can use. I am using parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme. So, if you're making this at home, you know what record to put on while you're working on this. The whole point of going through all of these steps to make this base or this broth or this gravy is because we're trying to create some really layered, robust flavors. We need spices, and because we're doing this in about an hour's time, that's really not a whole lot of time to create something that is that layered. So I'm gonna grab these spices. I've got whole allspice, I've got mace, I've got whole cloves, some cayenne pepper and salt. And the spices that are whole, I'm just gonna give them a little bit of cracks in this mortar and pestle so we can open them up and get them going in that really quickly. The nice thing about spices is that you can add a little bit and then you can add more. You can add more. You don't want to go too far right at the start, especially with something like clove. A little bit of clove can go a long way. So don't be overwhelmed by that. Add a little bit at a time. Add your salt, a little bit of cayenne, give it a taste, let it cook a little bit. You can always add more flavor to it, more spices. The reason that I said at the beginning of this episode that I was so excited about making Cullis is because, for me, this is a brand new thing that I saw a lot of common threads with through the 18th century cookbooks. And unlike John Townsend, I didn't grow up researching this time period. And so for me, coming and looking at cookbooks from the time period for the first time was all brand new information. And recipe after recipe after recipe, you see this word Cullis. So I had to figure out what that was. And I think the easiest way for me to work on 18th century recipes in the beginning was just to cook food that I was already familiar with. This is really exciting to figure out something that I had never even heard the word before I dove into an 18th century cookbook. So like I said, you see references to Cullis, or at least its predecessors, as early as the 15th century. And it slowly climbs in popularity until the 18th century. That is the Cullis heyday. People love it. They're using it all the time. And there are some versions of it that are just super complex. This one's probably a little bit middle of the road. But it's just like it's the thing that is making all of these fairly simple dishes pop, right? You can add something that has a ton of sweetness and a ton of spice into a dish that would really be pretty simple, and that pulls it all together and makes it something interesting. And it's something that you can jar up and you can store back. By the time you get to the 1830s, you're seeing Cullis kind of referenced a little bit, and usually that is a really stripped down version that lacks the acid. It's just more of a simple gravy. And so for the 18th century, it's just really fun to look at all the different ways they were using it before it eventually fell out of favor. By the 1850s, when you see it, it's kind of pointing back to history, back to recipes from the past. It's time to taste. I'm I'm really impressed with how this came out. It's got this kind of thick texture. You can see that, you know, there's some oil in there. The color is really surprising. It's not just a deep brown. It's you can see hints of all those kind of orange and yellow spices that we put in there. And typically you would have this in a dish where and it'd be the base, you know, like a soup base or a sauce. But we're just going to try it like this today to see what it tastes like by itself. In the future, after we bottle this up, we'll use it in a recipe on 18th century cooking. Whoa. That's really layered. Clove comes through. It's not super salty. I didn't want it to be super salty because when you're making it with whatever you're going to make it with, you're going to be adding salt, or if you cooked it again with ham, that would make it super salty. The butter certainly comes through. You know, it's kind of slick, but not too oily. But you definitely have the flavor of that fat. It's really good. You can taste the herbs in there. It's layered. It's super complex. It's not just a gravy, which is the whole point of this. It's a special gravy or a special sauce, and it certainly holds up to that. It's really fantastic. So we mentioned by the 1850s this was pretty much falling out of favor. I found this piece from 1877 that I thought was really interesting. It says Cullis is a word which at root means something smoothly gliding. Thus the sliding scenes of a theater that slip along in grooves are called cullises. And a liquid which is thick enough and smooth enough to slide is called cullis in French, cullis in English. Spanish sauce is often described as a brown cullis. That lets us know that the mouthfeel on this is where we're supposed to be, that smooth slide kind of thing going on. And then later it says, unhappily, the word is going out of use now, being replaced very much by the word cream, which has quite enough duty to perform on its own proper sense. So this writer is not a fan of it falling out of favor as something that's separate than cream, because it's not a cream. And so having that word be so broad kind of muddies up what you actually mean by that. And I think we see that a lot in cooking today, where we don't have as many words to describe the different things that we're cooking. If you look up cullis now, it'll tell you two things in the dictionary. One will be something like a gutter, so something that's running smoothly. It'll also tell you a clear broth for an invalid. So obviously nothing like what we've made here today. This is something that's rich and something that adds a lot to your food. So it's night and day now from then. And I don't know that it's a sad thing or a bad thing that it fell out of favor. I think that it just makes it fun to be able to dive in and see what we're missing and what we don't do anymore, and how flavors came through in a different way, or else people were more concerned about different aspects of flavor than we are now. Hello, I'm Ryan Kerr. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. Today we're going to be making a peas pudding meant to be had with bacon. It's going to be delicious. I'm so excited about it. Thank you for joining me today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. It's winter. Where we're at in northern Indiana, tomorrow and the next day we're supposed to get something like just shy of 20 inches of snow. Who knows if it'll happen, but it got me thinking about winter in the 18th century. Last year we talked a little bit about food preservation, and we kind of always do this time of year because that's important, especially the people in the time period that didn't have a grocery store nearby. And one of the things that people stored back, they would dry peas, they would dry beans and different grains, and they would store them back to get them through the winters. So when I was going through the cookbooks this morning, I thought, okay, what can we do that is dealing with stored food? And this peas pudding recipe just jumped off the page, and I thought, that was some bacon. That would be a nice, hearty, flavorful meal to have when it's stark and cold in winter. So that's what we're gonna do today. It's 3 ingredients, really. It's butter, peas, and bacon. It can't get any more simple. It's going to be a lot of fun. Today's recipe is brought to us from Mrs. Fraser in the book, The Practice of Cookery, Pastry, Pickling, Preserving, etc. And it is called a peas pudding to be eat with bacon. I would say et or eaten, but it says eat. It spells it right out there for us. Take a pound of split peas, or more as you have occasion. Tie them in a cloth, not too close, that they may have room to swell. Let them boil an hour, then take them up and mix a good piece of butter in them and tie them up hard. They will take near another hour's boiling. Divide the pudding in two and lay the pork in the middle. Send beet butter along with them to the table. It cannot be more simple. The only thing interesting or maybe hard from the 21st century perspective on this is the pudding cloth. What is going on? It says tie them up. So we're going to cover that a little bit. We'll try to shed some light on reading in between the lines of this recipe, but it's going to be simple and you guys can try it at home. I'm going to make some space for this pudding cloth real quick. If you have watched the channel quite a bit, you've probably seen a pudding cloth, but really it's nothing too special. It's just a piece of linen that we have, and we're going to use this to cook our peas in. So traditionally using these with boiled puddings, the first thing that you want to do is you're going to put it into boiling water and you're going to get all the fibers to tighten up. And then in that situation with a boiled pudding, I think every time I've ever used a pudding cloth, you'll bring it out of the water, spread it out, put flour on it, and then put the pudding inside. I don't really want to do that this time because there's no like paste to go with this. It's not a pudding. I'm just cooking these peas. I don't really want flour to mix in with these peas. So it could fail. I could do this wrong, but I'm not going to flour this. I am going to dip it into the boiling water to get the fibers to tighten up. We'll bring it back here, put the peas in, tie it loose enough that they can swell, and then they're going to boil for an hour. Okay, so we've got our peas, they're boiling. Make sure to leave some room in that pudding cloth. They are gonna swell quite a bit. These are dried up a lot, so they're gonna take on that water, they're gonna cook, they're gonna swell, and we don't want your cloth to burst. So give yourself some room. If you don't have green peas, you can use yellow peas, you can use black-eyed peas. If whatever you've got stored back or sitting around the house, that's what you can use for this recipe. It'd be even interesting to experiment with different kinds of beans. You could do that as well. This recipe did call specifically for split peas, so that's what I'm using here, but anything will work just fine. This recipe also calls for bacon, probably likely something like Canadian bacon. So that's what I have here. I've got it chopped up. I don't want to chop it up too fine. I want it to be able to kind of mix in with these peas when they're on either side for the plating. And that's one of the other things that was really interesting to me and drew me to this recipe was the plating style. I think that it'll just look really nice, and it's going to be something that's kind of like a family style plating, and everybody can grab some bacon, you can grab some peas, and you could, if you wanted to, you could stir it all together, or you can keep it separate, whatever you want, but it's just going to have a really neat feel to it. So right before we take the peas up in the final step, I'll just get a little bit of a brown on this bacon and we'll put it in between there so those juices will be coming out and it's all going to integrate nicely on the plate. It's been an hour. The peas have boiled the whole time for an hour, and I just wanted to show you. It says to leave room for them to expand, and it took all the room that I left, and I left more than I thought that I should. So make sure that if you're making this at home, to really leave room for these peas to be able to expand. They're going to soak up a lot of water in there. We've got our butter mixed in. It looks like it could be done right now. I don't know what this is going to turn out like, but the recipe calls for us to get it back in the cloth and to tie it up tightly this time. I don't think that that's so much like you need to squish it down or anything like that. It's just, it's done growing. It's not going to expand anymore. So we're going to get this tied up pretty tight and get it back in the boiling water for another hour. Our peas pudding is done. The bacon is fried. We've got some dollops of whipped butter. It looks like something. I'm sure it's going to be delicious. The only time I think that I've ever had peas porridge or peas pudding was down in Louisville, Kentucky, when John and I went down there to film an episode with Brian and Amy from Locust Grove about peas porridge pudding. I can't remember which one that was. Probably both the same thing. At any rate, that was delicious. We'll see what this is like. And I think that the idea here is that I should probably get a bite. It's got a little bit of everything. That is absolutely delightful. That is really way better than I thought that it would be. I opened up that pudding cloth and I went to pour it into the bowl and it just goes plop. And I thought, I get to eat this now. This is really, really good. The bacon gives you the salt that you need. We did add a little bit of salt and pepper. The butter, I don't know what that's doing, but it's doing something. It's coming in there. Maybe it's just giving you a little bit of fat. There's not a whole lot of butter in the pudding. It's like salty and earthy, and the bacon's got a great texture. So it's not just like, you see this and a lot of people think, oh, it looks like eating baby food. It's nothing. I've eaten baby food and it's nothing like that. This food is absolutely delicious and I would not have eaten it. I would not have tried it had it not been for wanting to make a video. Every video that we do is an adventure. It's like a stroll in the woods. You don't really know what you're doing, but you're gonna find something really cool. And I love that. I love making these videos.
Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend. And in this episode, we'll be making a delicious dessert cake with the main ingredient of potatoes. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. So this particular recipe comes from the dessert section of Amelia Simmons's American Cookery Cookbook from 1797, so 18th century, and it's in the cakes section. So cake, plum cake, plain cake, another plain cake, a rich cake, and then just underneath a rich cake is potato cake. You know, when I think potato cakes, I think savory, I think sort of like a biscuit, maybe even with cheese on it or something like that. It's nothing like that whatsoever. This is a sweet, small, I don't know. We're just gonna have to make it to find out. Here is the recipe out of American Cookery. Potato cake. Boil potatoes, peel and pound them. Add yolks of eggs, wine, and melted butter. Work with flour into paste. Shape as you please. Bake and pour over them melted butter, wine, and sugar. This is a strange little recipe. I mean, potatoes, I get that. I get the flour. We've got egg yolks, yes, but we have wine and melted butter in the cake itself. And then we pour over them a classic pudding sauce of the 18th century. So something that you would put on a boiled pudding. Oh, this is going to be really, really interesting. And I guess we have to interpret this too a lot because no ingredient amounts whatsoever. We have no idea. We just have to kind of guess as to where we're going to go with this. How much flour do we put in? How much wine? We have no idea. So we're going to have fun with this one. We got our mashed potatoes all mashed up in here nicely. And I've already added the liquid ingredients. About a half a cup of white wine. We have 3 egg yolks, just the yolks in here, so it's nice and yellow. And I added 2 ounces of melted butter. And so we've got, a batter consistency. And now it's time to add our flour until we get to what they call, or whatever we call, right, a paste. This is the question, right? How much flour do we need to add before we get to the consistency we need? And I mean, we don't even need to measure this. We're just gonna start adding it in until we get to that paste consistency. I love this kind of recipe because we get to do all the interpretation. We get to experiment and find the best way, at least that we think this should turn out. We know this should be thick enough that it's a paste. And it needs to hold its shape because we're gonna cut it into shapes. So I want this kind of thick, I think. And I think we'll cut them so that they're a ½ inch thick, something like that. That ought to bake up nicely. We baked these potato cakes at 350 degrees for 20 minutes. I expected them to get a little browner, but they didn't. I don't think it would matter how long we left them in the oven. They weren't going to get any browner. So they're done. And, let's see. Here's one that doesn't have much pudding sauce. So I kind of poured pudding sauce over these already. Without the pudding sauce, they're plain. I'll just call them plain. They have a really good texture, not too dense, not what you expect for, light and fluffy, like a biscuit maybe, but They have a very, very good consistency. Now, pudding sauce. That's the real question here. Got a whole bunch of pudding sauce down here. They're really good with the pudding sauce. There's a reason why the pudding sauce is in the recipe, obviously. This pudding sauce, it's 1 part wine, 1 part melted butter, and 1 part sugar. And it's like, well, frosting on the cake, really. It's that thing that sets it off. Cake all by itself, kind of plain. But put that frosting on there and whoa, it's really good. Same thing is going on with these guys. And don't forget the wine in this pudding sauce. It really makes a very, very big difference. I think it's one of those things that's missing out of our sort of palate today. We're expecting sort of, frosting with just lots of sugar and, butter or whatever. But the wine gives it a totally different edge and a very, very really good and different flavor. And I really like it, especially on these. And you can kind of see why the potato cakes on one hand are kind of plain, and then we have this wonderful pudding sauce that sets that off in a very, very good way.
Hello, welcome to 18th Century Cooking. My name is Ryan Kerr. Today I'm really excited to cook this dish that I think most people out there will be familiar with in one way or another. Thank you for joining me today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. Chicken and rice. We've all had it. We know the flavor profiles, whether it is just a rice dish with bits of chicken in there, or it's a soup, or it's a casserole that your grandma makes that's covered with cheese and has cream of chicken or cream of celery or mushroom soup in it, something like that. It doesn't matter. It always tastes good. If you like chicken and rice, if you like those two components, you like every time they're combined. You can't do it wrong. I read the recipe, and the first time that I read it, I thought, okay, there's not gonna be any broth in this. This is just gonna be a chicken and rice recipe. But then I went back to it, and I think it's gonna turn out more like a soup. Either way you go, what's interesting about this is it has a whole chicken, bones and all, cooked in this. And you see that a lot in the 18th century. We think of things like chicken pot pie or something like that, and we debone everything before we put it in. But they didn't do that a lot in the 18th century. So it's always kind of interesting to see something that we love to eat and we know in a modern sense, and how it's always a little bit different when you go back and look in the historical cookbooks. I'm excited to see what this turns out to be. So the recipe today comes from The English Art of Cookery. That's by Richard Briggs. I hadn't really gone into this recipe book a whole lot, so I dove into it a couple weeks ago, maybe last week, and there's just a lot of really great stuff in here. I'm always drawn to recipes that seem familiar in some way. I like that a lot, and I like to find stuff that I grew up eating or that I made for my kids when they were younger and trace that back and see what that looked like in historical context. So this recipe is called fowl with rice. Truss a fowl as for boiling. Put it into a stew pan with a quart of water, a bundle of sweet herbs, season it with a little beaten cloves and mace, some pepper and salt, cover it close and stew it half an hour. In the meantime, boil 4 ounces of rice in a quart of water till it is tender. Strain it off, put it to the fowl, and stew it for another 15 minutes longer, very gently. But take care it does not stick. Then put the fowl in a hot dish, take out the sweet herbs, and put the rice and sauce over it. You may use gravy instead of water if you want it rich. Today we're going to go with water. I want to see what this will taste like at its bare bones. We're not gonna do a whole lot of interesting. It's gonna be spiced with salt, pepper, mace, and clove. I've got a bundle of sweet herbs here. We're gonna throw that in as it cooks. It's a very simple recipe. Anybody can try it at home, and I can't wait to see what it turns out like. Okay, so first things first, the recipe starts out by telling us to truss this as if to boil. We're not actually going to boil it, we're stewing it. We're not gonna be putting this down into a big deep pot of boiling water where it would be difficult to get it out when it's finished. It's just gonna be in a Dutch oven with a little bit of water, so I'm not worried about trussing it. But I do have the bird here, we're ready to go. I've had the Dutch oven over here by the fire warming up, and it's ready. So we're gonna get some spices on this and get it cooking. Our chicken is looking fantastic. It's stewing over here in the water with the herbs and all the spices. It's gonna be fantastic. I'm excited about it. One of the things I thought was really interesting about this recipe is the ratio of rice to water. It calls for 4 ounces of rice to 32 ounces of water. And usually when you're cooking rice, it is 2 to 1 water to rice. So usually 4 ounces of rice would call for 8 ounces of water. So I was thinking about why, and I think the best I can come up with, and you guys in the comment section might be able to tell me a much better answer. But the best I can come up with is that they just want to keep the rice from getting starchy and sticking together. Usually you want the rice to absorb all the water in the cooking process, and then you just have your rice. But this recipe calls for extra water and for you to strain the water out at the end. So we're gonna follow the recipe. We're gonna see what happens. But if you're making it at home, I don't think that the ratio really is what matters. It's more about make sure you have plenty of water for your rice so that there's still some water left over when the rice is tender. It is finished. We have rice, which is thicker than I thought it would be. It's not so much a soup. It's more like a chicken and rice dish. The meat looks great. It looks like it was cooked really well, nice and tender. I don't know. I don't think I've ever had chicken and rice with mace and clove before. So we're gonna try this out, and I'll just get a scoop with everything on it. It's kind of a big bite. Oh yeah. Dang, that's good. So the chicken is so moist, and you would expect that because it was stewed in liquid. But that rice is just really good, and all those spices, I don't think they come through so much in the chicken, but in the rice. That's good. I'm going to sneak clove and mace into more chicken dishes at home and see if my family will go for it. I think it's really, really good. What I learned from this is that, I don't know, aside from the fact that the whole bird went in, bones and all, this tastes like a chicken and rice dish that I would make. So my kids like that a lot. I'll make it at home sometimes, other than the spices. And that's usually, I think that's what gets us, right? With going back and visiting something like, we've done that several times on the channel where it's something that we know and we like. And we find it in a period cookbook, so we go and check it out, whether it's fried chicken or mac and cheese. Even the steaks that we did not too long ago, there's always this thing that's a little like, oh, really? Those spices? That's what we're gonna do? And that's kind of how I've reacted to this as well. I really like it though. It's really good. I have a show on Townsends Plus called Unpacking the Pantry, and in that show, one of the things that I really like to focus on is taking recipes and making them more approachable for your modern kitchen. This is a perfect example of that. Anybody can make this at home. If you have a stew pan, if you have a Dutch oven that you can, put on your stove, if you have a saucepan that's big enough to fit this in, you can accomplish this. And I really encourage you to try it. There's something that's special about experiencing history through this way. There's something about the combinations of spices and the things that they do that we just don't do anymore, and that makes it fun. And it's fun for the whole family, so give it a try.
Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend. And in this episode, we're gonna be digging into a recipe that I just have no idea where it's gonna go. It is one that I picked out of the cookbook that I'm totally confused. It's called an herb pudding. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. So the recipe today comes from the experienced English housekeeper. This is Elizabeth Raffold, 1769. Now, here's the recipe, and you're probably thinking pudding, right? No, here we go. Herb pudding. Of spinach, beets, parsley, and leeks, take each a handful, wash them, give them a scald in boiling water, then shred them very fine. Have ready a quart of groats steeped in warm water about a half an hour, and a pound of hog's lard cut in little pieces. 3 large onions chopped small, 3 sage leaves hacked fine. Put in a little salt, mix all well together, and tie it up close. It will require to be taken up in the boiling to slacken the string a little. Okay, if you're like me, maybe 10 years ago, you'd read this recipe and think, what are they talking about? This is just totally, it was written in a strange way, and there's a lot of assumed things in this recipe that if you're just looking at it first blush, you don't know exactly what's going on. So let's start off with the idea of pudding. We think of pudding, we think dessert pudding, maybe dessert pudding in a cup, right? You just peel off the little foil and you just eat it right up. You don't have to do any cooking or anything. Maybe we're thinking pudding, when we think of pudding here in North America, we're thinking of a custard. That's what that stuff is. It's a custard in a cup. Puddings in the 18th century weren't that at all. They tended to be, well, what's the basis for pudding, right? The word pudding comes from the word pud. That's weird, isn't it? Which actually means gut or stomach. So these early puddings were something that you would cook in a stomach, cook in a bag. And they were, we could almost think of them like, well, you've heard of black pudding or white pudding. Those are almost like a sausage thing. So yeah, pudding has its basis in sausage. Yeah, so this pudding is a boiled pudding, and it's cooked in a cloth bag. So they don't even say that there. You get the hint. They don't say boil it, but it does say tie it up close. So we're tying it in a bag. This pudding, unlike many of them, which have flour as their basis, this has oatmeal, and a coarse cut oatmeal at that, groats. So it's not like flour, but it's a coarse oatmeal. And we've got herbs. Many of these puddings are sweet. This is savory. We've got herbs and we've got salt in here, and we don't have any sweetness at all. So what else do we have here? We've got spinach, easy enough. Beets. Well, everything else here is a green. So I believe they mean beet greens. Parsley, leeks, those are onion-like. We have onions in here. And then we have lard. We've got a mention of lard. And it says cut small. I think the hint for us right here on lard is it's a boiled pudding and it says cut it small. Normally boiled puddings have suet in them, and suet is very hard. It's like wax. Here's a piece of suet. It's hard stuff. You can chop it up. And that's what we want in a boiled pudding. What happens is that that suet melts and it creates little pockets. It makes it much easier and sort of light and fluffy, as it were, if you could think of light and fluffy and something boiled. Anyway, that's what's happening with this suet. This lard here is not the lard you're probably thinking of. It's probably leaf lard. Leaf lard or lard, they're both rendered fats from a hog, but they come from different places and they have a very different consistency. So today we're going to be using regular beef suet because I don't have any leaf lard that would work in this context. So all we need to do now is start to shred up our greens. This recipe calls for scalding the greens first. I don't think we're actually going to need to do that. They're going to be in this boiling mass for a long period of time, so I'm not worried too much about that. A handful. We're going to half this recipe, or else we would end up with this giant boiled pudding, and we don't need one that big. So we're going to start off with some just regular spinach leaves here and chop those up nice and fine. We've got some parsley greens. We're going to chop those up. Okay. You may not be familiar with leeks. Leeks are wonderful. Don't skip the leeks in this recipe. We're just going to take off the big green part. We don't want that. I'm going to get rid of that. And we're not going to cut down here into the very, very base, but we want this section of the leek. And we probably don't need all of this. This is a nice big leek. Again, we're doing a half recipe, so we don't need 3 whole onions in here. I'm just going to do a single onion. Sage can be a little strong, and I think that's one of the reasons why they only call for 3 leaves. And I'm just going to cut a little bit of sage in here. And we want to use nice, since everything else is a nice fresh green, we're going to use fresh sage in here. There we are. That should be sufficient. Now we can start to assemble this. We've got all the greens in our bowl already. Let me mix them up a little bit. Actually, it calls for a little salt, doesn't it? Let's put in some salt. There we go. Now we've got our salt in here. Let me just get a good mix on it, because once I put in this oatmeal, it's going to be a mess. There we go. So I just don't understand how this is going to turn out. Okay, we've got our suet. I think I'm going to mix the suet in now. Now we do have to be careful. We want this suet to remain cold. We don't want it to melt. So we don't want that to happen. So we're going to mix our suet in, and wow, it's a lot of suet, let me tell you. We're going to stop right there. Mix that in. Suet and herbs. I don't know. It's going to be great. There we go. Now, we have our oatmeal, our groats that have been soaking, and they're just warm now. They have been soaking a half hour in warmish, almost hottish water. I don't think we want them to totally swell up, so we don't want to put them in boiling water, but hot-ish water. And there it is. Boy, that's going to be a lot. This is a half pudding, and it's still going to be huge. So here we go. There we are. And this is what's going to hold it all together. This oatmeal is going to turn into, hopefully, a big gelatinous ball. That'd be great. So this is like a disaster waiting to happen. The more I watch this one go, I just don't know. Let's see how big. We don't want to make it huge, or it'll take too long to boil. And I don't know what it's going to turn out like anyway. Okay, let's put our pudding cloth together here. This pudding cloth was boiled, and then we put flour in it to help sort of hold everything together, although this particular fabric is pretty tightly woven, so that usually isn't too much of a problem. And we're going to bring this all up so that we don't want any gaps. And the recipe calls for taking it up and loosening it, so we know it's going to grow. So we don't want to make this really, really tight to begin with. We could make it really tight, but we don't want to do that. We're going to give it a little bit of slackness. But generally, there's enough here that, it can grow a little bit and not be a problem. I don't think I'll need to take this one up halfway around. If this was the full-size recipe and it was a big soccer ball of, of pudding, we might need to take it up, but this one, it'll be fun. You don't want your pudding cloth to burst halfway through your pudding. That is bad. But this is very strong fabric, so I'm not worried about that at all. There we go. It's ready to go in the boiling water. You don't want it to go into half boiling water. This goes into full boiling water, and this will probably boil, I'm guessing, 1 hour for this size. So let's get it into the boiling water. So are you guys ready for this masterpiece? Okay, this totally failed. This is not supposed to look like this at all. It's supposed to be in this beautiful, softball, big thing. It's supposed to look great. It's not supposed to have fallen apart. Look at this. It's terrible. It's not doing anything like what it should have done. That's what happens when you do a recipe and you haven't done it before, that exact one, and then and then it doesn't work out. Look at this. Okay, so I mean it was supposed to peel away from this, and it's all half of the pudding is still in the bag. And what went wrong? What went wrong? It smells good. It smells good. I went back and checked the recipe again, thought about what was going on here, and, well, I guess before I want to talk about what probably failed here is let's go ahead and try it out. Let's go ahead and find out whether it's tasty or not, right? So I'd get a little serving bowl, but I don't know what the point is. So we're just going to eat out of this big bowl, and here's a nice little serving. I mean, again, smells good. It just certainly doesn't look like it should. It's got some good flavor. The herbs came and, blended together. The leek, the onion, the other greens in there. It tastes great. Maybe you could use a little bit more salt in the mix. Other than that, I don't think I would change the taste a lot. You might consider it a little bland, so maybe we could add more greens to it to, bring in some more flavor. But other than that, I think it's pretty good. It's not, it's got suet in it, but that isn't one of the flavor notes that's way up there, so that's definitely not hurting it at all. So I'd say if it had worked out right, if it held into its pudding shape, then we would have a pretty fun dish. It'd be really neat. So why didn't it hold together? My guess is the directions, and it talked about steeping these groats. And, we went with steel cut oats here, and I think it was the right call on that for the grain. Could be that they meant something a little bit different than that. But I think what needed to happen was these oats needed to soak for longer in hotter water to bring out more of the gelatinous consistency. That's, I think, what was missing here. And so that if we would have steeped this in almost boiling water and maybe let it set an hour or two and really, got it to be a gelatinous mass, then this would have locked together exactly like it should have. But boy, it just did not happen. Maybe someday I'll have to revisit this guy or give it to Ryan to try again in one of his episodes. Maybe he can make this one work. I don't know. So I've done a lot of boiled puddings before. 10, 20, 30 boiled puddings, right? Never had one fail quite like this, but I've never made one with this kind of oat material. Oatmeal, maybe if it had more of the smaller particles of oatmeal. Maybe if we mix this a little bit with, a ground oatmeal, Maybe not, 100%, but just a little bit of that in this would help that really lock together and give us our nice, boiled pudding look. Just like the Christmas boiled pudding that comes in, in a nice round bowl. That's what we want out of this one. So what's the takeaway here? The takeaway is it doesn't always work out. And we shouldn't be scared about, dipping in and trying these recipes. And it might take 3 and 4 tries to get this one right. The recipes are very difficult to interpret sometimes. And it could be also we need to look at some other cookbooks and see if they do something similar, and maybe they've got some extra hints that we need to figure out how to make this one work. But again, the flavors are all here. The texture maybe isn't perfect, but the flavors are all here, so we can get an idea about what's happening in 18th century cookery with a recipe just like this one. And it certainly turned out interesting. Cookware in the 18th century is so different than cookware that we have today. It's made out of different things and it's designed differently. We're going to be talking about 18th century cookware, how it's different from cookware today. We got this wonderful guest here, Michael Dragoo, who's been on the channel many, many times, and he loves collecting 18th century cookware. So he's brought much of his collection in here. Thank you, Michael, for bringing all of this wonderful stuff in. What are we starting out with?
So we're going to start today with trammels. Trammels would have held the bulge pots and all the other cooking implements that were used. In all 3 of these cases, there would have been a lug pole, about yay big in diameter, green wood, and it would have been put up and behind and in front of the fireplace. There are smaller versions of all of these, and they would have been used on a crane. And you've seen those in fireplaces. They're hinged on one side or the other, a triangular manner, and you can position your vessel over whatever fire source you've got.
Interesting thing about these particular pieces that you got here is that they're huge. These things are big. We got to think about what's going on with cooking in the 18th century. Their hearths were giant. We think of little fireplaces in houses today, and they're only, maybe this high. A fireplace in the 18th century might have its hearth at my head height, the mantelpiece. So they're giant. And we might have very large outdoor cooking things too.
Right.
So we need big trammels and S-hooks. So one of the things we carry is just a simple small S-hook. It's not very useful when you've got a giant pot or a huge, tall fireplace. So there's a lot of different things that we use to, keep things up off the fire in the 18th century. Right. We don't need those much today, do we?
This is a hook and chain. It's the most universal. You would bring it around the lug pole and then bring it through your bale or hook it directly to the bale. It could hang more than one vessel at a time. The next one is a sawtooth. This would have been either in a summer kitchen or in a barn or outside if you're reducing animal fats, or you're making apple butter or something where you've got a large pot and you need a lot of space. And then you're adjusting just by moving this up or down. And as your fire's going, you're wanting to sometimes simmer or boil. So as things happen in the pot, you're just wanting to, without having to change the fire source, you're bringing the pot away from the fire source a little bit.
Yeah, you need a lot of adjustability in the 18th century because you are working with a wood fire and it's going up and down in heat all the time. So you have to have this very adjustable way to move your pots up and down.
And I need help. My largest bulge pot is probably a 5 or 6 gallon. And I can't lift it with one hand and adjust this with my other 2 hands. I need help, and they needed help in the kitchen. And the third one is called a lug and hole. This is a very primitive one. It's I would call it farm forged.
Oh yeah.
Someone needed one bad enough and they didn't care what it looked like. It's been roughly punched. It's been roughly put together with several pieces. But the gist of it is very much like the sawtooth. This thing is going up and down. You're pulling this out, and you're raising or lowering, and you're popping it in a hole, whatever height. It's the easiest one for me to work with, and when I'm on location, I bring these others to show, but I use this one. This is the easiest for me.
Some of the things that we're going to be looking at today are cast pieces, cast iron. These are forged, so blacksmith is going to be making these, and we can see wonderful welds that these were put together. They didn't have one long strip of metal that was exactly the right length, so they had to weld this thing together and then punch the holes. It's a lot of work, even though it seems like a pretty crude piece.
And they're not going to the local big box store and buying pieces of iron. They're remanufacturing things. If something's broken and can't be repaired, it turns into something else. I didn't bring it today. We're not talking about that type of thing, but I've got a chopper that used to be a wood file. The iron file got dull. They didn't have a way to sharpen it, and so they turned it into something else they needed worse. And you can imagine that this piece may have come from something on a wagon or something. These pieces may have been from something else. The guy needed a trammel, and he created one.
This one's a great example, this particular trammel, in that even the metal they used is different than what we would do today. Any blacksmith today is just going to grab a nice piece of mild steel and work it. And it just works like butter compared to the steel or the iron they were working with in the 18th century. This is wrought iron, and you can almost see it. It's like got a grain like wood. Wonderful to see these old pieces made out of the metal they used in the 18th century. If you're interested in wrought iron and how it works and how it's different, I had a great interview with Jamie Tyree, and it's a great one to reference for how wrought iron really works and how it's different.
Trivets.
Yeah.
Trivets. Many sizes, many shapes, virtually the same usage. You're trying to keep your vessel off the fire. In this case, we're not hanging from above. We're supporting from below. We're going to bring our coals or our fire source, our heat source, into up front, and we're going to use a variety of things to keep a variety of differently shaped vessels off the fire.
There are also trivets that aren't necessarily for keeping things up off the fire, but just off of hot surfaces. So if we're using a Dutch oven and we want to bake a pie in it, then we need something to take our pie pan and bring it up off the bottom of that, or else it'll burn our pie in the bottom. So we always use a nice small trivet like this one. It goes underneath our pie pan, just holds it up off the surface, and gives us like convection heat all the way around it without burning the bottom. So we've got, low trivets, we got high trivets. You might have several different ones for kind of heat sources.
When I'm using my brazier, sometimes I want it higher than the brazier. You can use these a variety of different ways. And these are triangular because in a round pot, you can always find a center.
We've got gridirons here and similar pieces. How do we cook? We're either on the fire, we can use them as a trivet, or we can cook meat right on the fire. You got a lot of different designs here.
Yep.
We've got a rotating one, so obviously this was probably used a lot more for cooking meat right on the fire, so you could rotate it around, get an even cook.
Plus, if your radiant heat is here,
you're right,
and you've got a vessel here, you're turning it so it's evenly cooking. Once again, it's very flexible.
These two are good examples of a variation. So this one is something you'd find in a household. It's got rigid handles and everything where you've got lots of space. You want one that works, and you can store it. But if you're traveling, this is a replica of the George Washington grill. So we have in the museums his whole cooking outfit, and you can see it folds up. It does exactly what that one does, except we can put it into a small space. When I look at period pieces or older pieces, I love when we find the wear and tear on one, and we can see the age in it. This one's fun because it's done a lot of rusting over the years. It's not new. We have a lot of pitting on it, so we know it's an older piece. And how it would be constructed, they don't construct things the same way today as they constructed them in the 18th century. This isn't a bolt, this is a rivet that was welded into place. We can see the individual welds and how they got these bars to stay in place. Today you would use a welder that is like an electric welder or a gas welder. In the 18th century, they had this on the forge. They had to heat these two things up to white hot metal and hammer them together. And that's hard to do.
Griddles could come, once again, in any shape and any size. We've got a couple of them. This is a really old griddle, and this is a little newer. This one is going to sit on a trivet or something, rocks, bricks, something holding it off the fire.
Right.
And this one has its own legs, but you can also hang it.
This one reminds me of how they would cook, you know, griddle cakes, oat cakes in, say, Scotland. This piece is, I am really, it's hard to say. It's old enough that it's, you know, so rusty that it's hard to understand exactly how it was made, but I believe it is probably cast iron, cast like they cooked, or like they cast firebacks in the 18th century. Although the handle looks like it might be welded on, but I think this is just so that it had extra strength here, these little bosses. But this is an incredible piece. I love this one.
Nothing runny. I'll tell you, it has to be something with more body to it.
Right. But you know, pancakes and all those things you can cook right on these. This one, wow.
We're starting to get a little ridge to it.
Yeah.
It's an earlier one. It's these. They were coming up with these things up through Victorian times. I probably in the 1910s I could have purchased one, but this is just the way it's constructed. Is a little older. Just the way they forge these together in the simple castings. They aren't complex castings, so that's kind of how you date these things. It's a drawn piece of iron instead of a piece of wire. In this time period, they don't have steel wire they're drawing. They're taking a piece of iron and they're heating it and they're drawing it out. Yep. Wafer irons, waffle iron, everything from under the sun, any shape, any floral or design pattern. These could be communion wafers. They could be just any kind of wafer, but a wafer is paper thin. I've done these on demonstrations a couple years now, and I get 3 out of every 5 or 6. They are easy to burn. You're buttering it each time. You're putting a little bit of stuff in. You're pressing it together. You're heating both sides hotter than heck. And then you're, just for a short period of time, when it starts to look brown on the outside, you pop it out, and you've got a nice wafer.
This is a waffle iron, and it's a totally different item, right? So instead of a really thin, crisp little cookie thing, this is going to make a waffle like we think of waffles today. This one's a beautiful handmade waffle iron. A lot of these would have cast pieces. This is a cast on forged handles. So these are little cast pieces on forged handles. This is actually forged all the way. So it's kind of a rare piece in that usually you would actually see this as a cast piece, even the waffle irons. But this one, somebody went to the effort to make a forged one, which is pretty neat.
I think they were just showing off their skill. I would still call it farm forged.
Oh yeah.
It's not a professional person doing it, but someone had enough talent to take a piece of iron and shape it accordingly, and then they're rolling this up into as close a circle as they can. Right. They're taking this piece and gouging and then cutting it or forming it to fit. Here's a handle attached. This one has 1 or 2 attachments for its handle. It's in umpteen parts, and it's got a, once again, a rivet. This is all, it's not like something I can unscrew to take apart. It's all, it's staying together.
And these are all used very similarly. You just basically set these in the coals and wait for them to bring it up to heat. Now these, you don't get too hot. You don't get them red hot, but this is our salamander. This you would get red hot. You bring this is an actual cooking method to heat something that you wanted to sort of broil the top of. So today, in a fancy restaurant, they might do it with a blowtorch. They'd come in and heat up the top of the item you're cooking, a lot of times desserts or whatnot, and caramelize the sugar on top. In the 18th century, you would use a salamander. You'd get this red hot in the fire and then bring it over and cook the very top just before you put it on the table. And this one also reminds me of the connection with hoe cakes. So we did a couple of hoe cake episodes, and sometimes there's the thought that, oh, hoe cakes were cooked on hoes. And it turns out that there is an item, a cooking item in the 18th century that was called a cooking hoe that resembled a hoe, but actually it was almost exactly like a salamander, except it tended to have the handle bent a little bit, and they resembled a hoe, but they were intended for cooking. And you could cook on top of a salamander too. You wouldn't get it as hot, but you could make very, very small sort of pancake items. Use them like a tiny griddle.
Some of these recipes will refer to your fireplace shovel as well. These were much, and that was something that was moving coals around and the like, and you'd clean it off, heat it up, and put your hoe cake or whatever right on it. Yeah. And then we've got these guys, they're toddy irons, or they have umpteen names. many sizes. Sometimes it's a large ball, depending on if it's a bowl of an adult beverage or if it's just a small personalized vessel. But you heat this up, you've got your mixture of sugars and spirits, and it's plunged in, and immediately the sugars surrounding it are caramelized, and it's a taste like you can't get unless you do that.
Right. Yeah, if you've heard of loggerheads, like people are at loggerheads.
Yes.
A loggerhead is a larger version, is the same thing, and people at loggerheads are fighting. Well, it'd be people with two different ones. Imagine this, but 3 or 4 times bigger. They're trying to hit each other. Yeah, if you're at loggerheads with somebody, you're fighting with a larger version.
Or you're very dense. You have a dense skull.
There are times when we just want to roast meat over the fire. We have a couple of different items that we use for that, but they're generally called spits. So we're going to use a spit. This is a hanging spit. It's a very small one. We have a square rod here, not a round one. And the reason for that is if we had a round rod and we were trying to rotate it, the meat will slip on that and rotate around, and we can't heat it properly. We can't cook it. So we use a square one, and then many times we'll use these little spit forks that come in from the side. They're made so that they can't rotate on that, and the meat stays where it needs to be. And in this case, we have a special hanger for it, or we might have hangers that come down from the top to do the spit to hold it up, or we could even have a whole piece that comes up from the bottom, sort of like a trussel that holds up our spit. Yep.
They had clock mechanics turning these things huge pieces. I think your oven, your reflective oven could very well have that in it.
Right. And then we have a simple hanging spit.
Yep. You might be smoking something. This thing may be way up in the chimney. It could be down roasting meat.
It can be more difficult because the top side of the meat doesn't get cooked as well, and so you have to take it off of the spit and then hook it back on another direction. But they are a simple and versatile thing.
We have to hold the vessels up in some manner. Once again, they weren't producing wire per se. If they needed a piece of wire, they're going to have to take a hunk of iron, heat it, and just continually draw it out until it's thin enough to use. It's much easier to just have one of these pot lifters. I've got 4 or 5 of them in my collection. They can be really long, they can be really short, but you're taking this thing and you're hooking it in the ears, which is what the ears are for. You can hang it on your crane or any S-hooks, anything you care to hang it on. And I use these exclusively when I'm at events. I either have a tripod or I rig up a lug pole, and I only use these to hang them. I brought another item with me. It's made of iron. It's kind of crude, and yet it's kind of elegant in its simplicity. Someone needed a lifter of some type. I'm guessing it was for our wood stove, which is out of my time period, but it needed love, and I brought it home and added it to the collection. But what it's showing is that whether they started with many pieces of iron and then brought them together at each end, or started with a large piece of iron, split them, did this decoration, and then brought them back together. Somebody just took the time to, and it's a heat sink, kind of. It's not really, it's still hot, but it's just pretty. And someone went to the trouble, took the time to go to the trouble, and not just create a quick tool that was handy, but to give it some of their own personal touch. So you see that over and over again. It might be some simple end to a handle or some just decorative bit on a leg, something that nobody you see, but somebody wanted to just put themselves in that piece. Yeah. And I'll tell you, 100, 200, 300 years later, when I'm using these things, that's so cool to just be a steward and to pass these on when I'm done with them. Mortar and pestle. These things have been used since 800, 700 AD. And I know before that's when I start seeing it in writing. It can be out of a variety of things. We've got large ones out of wood. Depends on what you're reducing. You can reduce meats to get them fibrous using a wooden mortar and pestle. But if you're talking about grains, seeds, some spices, you're going to need to get into something. This is going to be a very fine grind, and this is going to be a little coarser.
These are the food processors of the 18th century. We want to, turn something into a mush. We want to break it down into the smallest possible sort of components. We might even want to turn something into a paste. We're going to do a mortar and pestle.
They haven't figured out the cylinder and the screw yet to be able to reduce it to be hamburger. Right. If I wanted a hamburger, I'd have to mince it and then put it in here and reduce it further till it's fibrous. And we found on that meatball, a video we did ages ago, that was 2 or 3 different meats. One of them was a smoked ham, a cured ham of some type. And that does not want to behave. It needs to, it just wants to be little bitty pieces. So you've got to turn it into fibers to have it connect with other things.
And you'll see in early painting, 17th century and 18th century, mortar and pestles that are giant. So you'll see marble ones that are this big around that you could really work on large pieces at once. They're amazing pieces, and you just don't see them used in cooking too much today. I mean, we'll see small ones like this for kind of grinding up spices and herbs, but we don't use them that much today.
And we've seen on the different places we've gone, or native settlements, you'll see a larger stump, that's been burnt, controlled charcoal burnt down, and it's hollow, and now they've got something else that they're just reducing the corn with.
Now we got to the amazing collection here of all these cooking vessels per se. Tell me about what we got.
Well, to your right, we have skillets in a variety of forms, and that's just a couple of the ones, and from different time periods. These are posnets in brass, but mostly iron. And then these are bulge pots or cauldrons, or call them what you will. And like I said before, I've got, I think it's like a 6-gallon one, which I can hardly lift, all the way down to these little guys.
We've got some really interesting things going on with a lot of these. Now, the fun thing I like about the posnets is because they're used on a fireplace, and if we look at a lot of them, especially the earlier they are, look at this one. It really shows off what's going on. Yeah. You put this on your brick hearth, right? And you're cooking in it, and you're done. You drag it back to where you're working because it's hot. You don't want to lift it up. And the feet on the front always get sort of ground off. And so they all sort of, as the older they get, the more they tip forward. Yes. So we can see them get used over and over. Early, they're made out of brass. Same thing is true for these guys. The pots from the 16th century and the 17th century were made out of bell metal or brass, actually a bit more like bronze. And they're not actually as healthy. You can poison people with those. So to make them less expensive, easier to produce, and safer to use, they moved into cast iron as time went on. So this brass one is probably a little earlier than these iron ones, which get popular in the late 18th century and very, very popular in the 19th century.
Inside of that. That's called a gate.
Right.
Where the metal is entering the form. And once again, the fewer, that's kind of how you date it. In the time period, they're not very sophisticated with their tempering. And we're talking about iron here, not steel per se. And so there's nothing as hard as this. It's like trying to grind or file a diamond with a diamond, or file a piece of wood with a piece of wood. Right. So they're not finished. Right. The casting is broken off, and it's just, and these feet aren't one piece. They've been welded on. Well, roughly.
The feet are actually cast separately and then set into the mold and then cast around them.
Yep. And so you see these time and time again of these rough, unfinished edges.
And as someone who sells a current version of these kinds of pots, they are amazing work because of the thinness of the metal. So most foundries today don't want to cast anything nearly as thin as these pieces were done in the 18th and 19th century. The problem with them as they cast very thin is there's a bunch of pieces that just don't work out. It's like, well, that one we'll throw out. So maybe half of the ones they cast were no good. But since labor was inexpensive, they didn't have a problem with that. When labor gets expensive, then, well, every single one has to turn out. So we'll increase the thickness of the wall so that we get 95% of them to turn out every time. So you can tell an old one every time, they're super thin.
And this one, he was just talking about the wear of the legs. And I've got a couple that This one is
so thin,
not unlike its owner, pot-bellied. The legs have been drawn so many times, it's starting to rub on the bottom. It doesn't sit on its legs anymore. Actually, one we just used in a video earlier, this guy right here. Can you move that guy for a second? the metal may have been softer, or they just, for some reason, but look, you can see how that's sitting at an angle. And that's what he's talking about. These things are used so often, over and over again, pulling, hundreds of years in some cases.
So these can look like they're almost exactly the same thing, but these are related to frying pans. They're skillets, and the posnets are really the ancestor to saucepans. They have a much higher top to them, and unlike today's saucepans, they generally had a rounded bottom. Exactly why they had a rounded bottom instead of a square bottom, maybe it's because we don't want to, it's harder to make a round bottom pan today. We don't need that because we're putting them on burners, but these were always made to use over the fire, so they tended to have this rounded bottom. So Michael, all these pieces you brought in are beautiful in that they're wonderfully seasoned.
Yes.
So when we're using cast iron in the 18th century, and people still use cast iron today, this is as close as you can get to a Teflon pan, a Silverstone pan. They're non-stick surfaces that if they aren't seasoned, you could not cook in them.
Right.
They're terrible. So tell us about your seasoning. What do you
well, I think I do the same way you do. I'll set my oven, the home oven, to 550, thereabouts, as hot as your oven will go. And I'll put the piece in and let it get too hot to the touch, but not that high a temperature. I'm trying to get the molecules of the iron to just expand a little bit. And then I pull it out and I put it on top of the stove where it's not going to burn my countertop. And I'll take some Crisco, if I can mention name brands, it's a purified fat, and I use a paper towel and I'll just coat the entire surface. And then I'll take more paper towel and I'll remove as much of that as I can. I don't want anything puddling, otherwise I'm going to have troubles down the road. So I'm just completely covering it, completely removing it. I turn it upside down and put it in the oven, and I don't touch it again. I leave it at 550 till it stops smoking. You're trying to carbonize that oil. You want this finish. You don't want something sticky. You should never. Ooh, I'm going to get letters probably. There are lots of ways of seasoning, and the way that doesn't foul the iron and doesn't go rancid is to carbonize some kind of fat. And I try to go for the pure fat because I don't want impurities in my...
Right. Flaxseed oil is one of the lowest temperature ones that happens, so flaxseed oil can work well. A lot of different oils work well, and there are probably 10 or 20 different ways to season, and there's a lot of controversy. No, this is the best way to season, and that's the best way. I say whatever works for you is what works for you on seasoning, but it seals the iron and it makes it non-stick.
Right.
It keeps it from rusting. There's just so many reasons why.
Let's look at the inside of that.
Yeah.
There's some rough there.
Yeah, this one's super rough on the inside.
I've seasoned that about 3 times. I'm ready for the next season. It's super rough. It was full of rust, and it's not going to stick.
But what's the killer on seasoning? What's going to ruin your seasoning the fastest? There you go.
Mr. Spatula is the arch nemesis of seasoning, and that's all they had to work with. They weren't having plastic. You would use wood, and I use wood. Very rarely will I use this, but.
At least on this kind of a surface.
That'll ruin you've got to go back and re-season, because if you don't, you're going to have sticking food.
Right, just like today.
Yeah. You don't use animal fat and then put it in your drawer, because it'll go rancid. And then the iron, you have that rancid taste from the iron. It's just like if you went nuts and started scrubbing and using a soap scrubby. I use my scrubbies I make out of broom straw, and I use water, and I'll let things soak. But once I'm done scrubbing it, it's all off. I'll dry it, and then I turn it upside down on my burner, on my stove, and just try to get all that water off. Yeah, just to get that water off.
Right.
You do that, they'll last, once again, forever. They've lasted 300 years so far.
Right, and this it goes right down into the pores of the iron to seal it so that it won't rust and is easy to clean.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Michael, for bringing all these amazing pieces in. Many of these pieces are 150 years old, 250 years old, and it's incredible to see how they're still useful. We still can enjoy them. We cook in them. Many times we're doing a cooking episode, and you bring in an old piece, and we're cooking in that. So I always find it really fun to use these old pieces and compare and contrast them with, modern pieces that we would use today, how much different these are, and, we can still enjoy them. So I really like this.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much. You're welcome. It's a kick to just be the caretaker for a while,
right.
to bring them back and lovingly use them and then pass them on. It's such a thrill.
They'll still be useful in another 150 years.
Easily.
Welcome to this very special edition of 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend, and today we're doing a recipe that I have never done before, and I have no idea how it's going to turn out or even how to do it. It's called How to Make Hertfordshire Cakes. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. This set of directions, a recipe, is from The Country Housewife's Family Companion by William Ellis. This is 1750. And let me read to you these directions, we'll call them that. How to make Hertfordshire cakes, nuts, and pincushions. These are much used in Hertfordshire for giving farmers' servants a changeable dinner now and then to their satisfaction. For if they are made as they should be, the men are generally fond of them. To do which, our housewife puts skimmed milk and hog's lard over the fire, warms them only for mixing, then takes some flour, sugar, yeast, an egg or two with the powder of Jamaica spice, and makes a paste of these and the milk and fat as if for pie crust. And when it is worked and rolled enough to the thinness of about 1/4 inch, she cuts these out to 2-inch square pieces, boils them in hog's lard in a little kettle or in a stew pan or frying pan. Others roll up this paste in the shape of walnuts and dress them the same manner as the square pieces. And then there's a note. No fat is so good for this as hog's lard. You know it. Because the lard hollows the cushions or nuts and makes them look whiter than any other fat does, though some want for this to make them with drippings, etc. So there we go. It's some kind of like English donut? I have no idea. So, I'm not even sure exactly how these are going to turn out. There's some interesting things here. We've got the use of warmed up fats and milk, so we mix with the flour here. And what are they spiced with? Not expensive nutmeg, nope, Jamaica spice, probably referring to Jamaica pepper, which is another name for allspice. So it's likely this is, that's a spice that's coming in from the West Indies, not nearly as expensive to bring in as something way out from, the South Seas or the East Indies. So an inexpensive spice, we can still make them spicy for these servants, but notice these aren't for the well-to-do table, but these are for the workers in your farm. So let's walk through this. We've got all the ingredients here. I got all the different things listed here, but of course we have no idea, except for an egg or two, we have no idea what the amounts are. Isn't it funny that he says that, and right above it, it says, if they are made as they should be, the men will like them. So, but he doesn't actually tell us what the amounts are supposed to be. Well, we're just going to have to kind of bumble our way through this. We can use some of the experience we've had with recent episodes and kind of get a guess. We do have a hint here. We do have a hint as to the consistency. We're supposed to get all these things mixed together, and they're supposed to be like a pie crust. So that gives us a hint. And we know that we're going to start to work with our liquids first, which is skimmed milk. So the inexpensive thing again, right? So these are for servants. We don't want to use the good stuff. We're going to use skimmed milk. I've got maybe 2 cups, 1.5 cups. Don't want to make a giant quantity. And then for the fat, instead of using something rich like butter or, using cream, no, we're going to use lard. So let me just get a couple of ounces of lard off of here. There's our lard. This needs to warm up. Unlike a pie crust where we have cold butter and we mix it in. Nope, we're not doing that. We don't need to have a flaky pie crust here necessarily, so we're gonna warm these up. So let me put this on the fire. Again, just warming them up. We've got yeast that comes in later on. We don't want it to be hot and kill the yeast. So just warmed up. So the lard and the milk are heating up over here. While they heat up, let's get these sort of dry ingredients here. Again, we don't know exactly how much flour we're going to use right off the bat. I'm going to put about half of what I've got here in our main mixing bowl. We've got our Jamaica pepper for flavor, and I've got powdered allspice here. And again, boy, I just don't know. I'm going to go with, I don't know, about a teaspoonful, and mix that into our flour. And the rest of the ingredients, well, we got sugar here. Now, how much sugar should we put in? How sweet do we expect them to be? Well, these are for working guys. They would have probably skimped on the sugar. I'm not going to necessarily skimp on the sugar. Let's put a 1/4 cup in. I don't know. We'll mix that in nicely. And no salt. No, not called for. It's sweet, so the other ingredients here are yeast, an egg or two, and then our mixture. So here's our warmed up, again, not too hot. We don't want to kill off our yeast. We're just gonna pour that in. Let's see, about 2 cups worth. There we go. Again, we don't know exactly where we're going, but I doubt that the amounts have to be just super perfect anyway. It's kind of sloppy. It's not going to be a paste yet. We'll have to add other things, but let's get our other liquids. I've got 1 egg in here. Since we're not making a giant mixture of this, let's get that egg mixed in there. And it's still just a little bit warm, so it's perfect time for us to put our yeast in. You can use standard yeast you're going to find in the store, you know, packet yeast. I would take maybe a half a packet and put it in just a little bit of water to dissolve it, and then in it goes. The yeast in the time period would have been liquid yeast you got from the brewer, and it's probably pretty similar. Okay, definitely not paste-like enough, certainly not. So let's add more flour. There we go. We'll see how this mixes in. There we go. A little bit more flour. Ooh, using up all my flour. Have to get more. So we end up needing even more flour, but that's all right. Still just a hair more. Okay, now it's starting to really get there. I don't want it to be so hard I can't roll it out, but I don't want it to be super soft either. At least, I don't know. I mean, the directions don't necessarily say so, right? So, but we'll get it. We'll get in there. We'll get it right. So there you go. Yeah, it looks good. Don't tell anybody. Yeah, I think it's going to be about right. Right kind of sweetness to it. Not too much, not too little. Got that allspice there. Oh yeah. This is going to turn out really good. Let's sprinkle a little flour out and roll this into our 1/4 inch thick stuff. There we go. There we go. Let's see what the other side looks like. Yep. So you might wonder why William Ellis's recipe is so vague. And really, he's giving a direction to people who aren't necessarily farmers. He's like saying, this is what farming life is like, and here are some ideas. He knows that the people who are actually going to be using it, either that they aren't ever going to do it, this is just a description so they know what's going on, or the person in the kitchen already has a good idea. It's like, oh, you mean just make that kind of paste and then fry it up, right? So that's what's going on there. They expect the person to already know kind of what it's going to be like. And we get some ideas because we've read lots and lots of other recipes in the 18th century cookbooks. We can get a good idea. Just like the mixing of this, the heating up the milk and the lard is just like the cracknels that we did very recently, almost exactly the same thing. So we get an idea about exactly why they're going where they're going with some of this description. We don't need to have exact amounts because we're going to adapt this to our needs anyway. So I'm getting close. It's about a 1/4 inch thick. This stuff always wants to kind of go back to its thicker, trying to go back to the ball, doesn't it? But this is probably about right. It depends on how we want to cook these also. If we make them too thick, then they'll be a little trickier to get them fried up right. If we make them a little thinner, they'll be easier to cook. But he called them, what, 3 different things. Cakes, which usually means just sort of like little, you know, like little cookie shapes, right? And then the nuts, which means to make them in a nut shape, like a walnut. And then, what's the other one? It was pin cushions, sort of puffed up like a donut. Yeah. So we're gonna cut these up into little squares. Okay, our fire is going. Let's get the pan on the fire to warm this up. And, you know, it called for 2 different methods. We could either sort of deep fat fry them in the little kettle, or we could pan fry them. I figure, yeah, if you're gonna try these at home, let's do pan frying. That's a little bit easier. We don't have to have special equipment. And, you know, it didn't say necessarily to fry them in lard, but he didn't say to not do that. So we've got the lard here, let's do it. Okay, so for the first couple ones I put in there, the oil was probably a little too hot. And they puffed up though. They did this thing. They did, I mean, remember they called it a pincushion. Well, looks like they did exactly what a pincushion would do. The oil's a little, not quite so hot here, so these are probably gonna be a little more dense. I'll let the oil heat up again for the next batch. Again, we can kind of experiment and see exactly how they turn out depending on how hot they cook. Here they are. Look at those things. They're beautiful. It turned out I didn't have to experiment too much, and they smell great. Okay, I cheated. Obviously, you can see I sprinkled sugar over the top of these guys. I'm surprised I wasn't scraping nutmeg on them. I didn't do that. I put the sugar on, but I didn't do the nutmeg because they have allspice in them. Let's try one out, right? So they smell a little meaty because, of course, they've been cooked in lard. But you know, that's what they called for. Nice and tender, not too dense. Look at this guy. They called them pin cushions, right? Well, you can see it looks exactly like a pin cushion. Depending on exactly what the temperature of that fat in the pan, boy, that yeast took off and, you know, they grew right up, and it'll be like a hollow spot in the middle. Look at that, sort of, you know, like a popover or something. Super good, cooked all the way through. They cook really fast. That 1/4 inch thick, they just cook right up. You know, if it was the nut style where you made them a little, you know, bulkier, they're a little more dense because of the way they cook, but still really, really good. So this allspice flavor comes through wonderfully. Again, that kind of gives us a fall time period, and fall is when these are probably being made most of the time. These are, when you have a lot of farm workers in that time period, it's generally harvest time. So these are a harvest time thing that you would have in that time period. And again, not a dessert for the rich man's table, but the dessert for servants. And boy, are they good. It's always fun with these experiments where there's a lot to learn, and really the only way to find out exactly what they're going to be like is to cook them up, which is what we've done here. You know, if I did it over and over again 3 or 4 more times, I'd adjust this a little bit more. You know, I'd probably put a little bit more sugar if I wanted them to be sweet in their, you know, in the dough part, not just on top. And we could play with maybe a little bit of salt, maybe a little of this or that. But, you know, with just guessing the way through this recipe, it turned out great. And again, the only way you can really find out about some of these recipes or even ideas is to just go at it and try it and see what happens. And it gives us a really good idea about what this 18th century recipe was trying to get at. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend. Can you imagine in the 18th century, pumpkin spice pancakes? Yeah, apparently they made them, and we're gonna try them out. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. I spend a lot of time just sort of browsing 18th century cookbooks. I really enjoy it. And many times, you know, you don't find something new, and then other times you open up another book and amazing things just sort of pop out of the page. Generally, if a recipe reads to make pancakes, I don't bother to read it. This particular one caught my eye. And so I am happy to bring to you something that's just titled How to Make Pancakes. Pretty simple, right? But this one is filled with spices that we would obviously call pumpkin spice pancakes. I was just actually pretty astounded that they put this many flavors in the exact way that we would think of as pumpkin spice. So these are going to be a wonderful fall thing to try out. It's perfect for this time of year, isn't it? And we all love to make pancakes. They're so simple. I think we should try these out. So the recipe book that these come from is called, let me get this right, The Accomplished Lady's Delight. And then it goes on like usual titles in preserving and physic and beautifying, cookery and gardening. It actually keeps going further, but we'll stop at that title. The author, a lady. We don't even know who she is, but it's a wonderful cookbook. This is from 1719, so it's an older cookbook, at least for the 18th century. And that's probably why it's so spicy. It's not the simple pancake that you would find in American cookery almost 100 years later, but it's one that's so rich in spices. And I haven't had a pancake like this before, and I love pancakes. To make pancakes, 2 words, pancakes, I love it. Put 8 eggs in a quart of flour, casting by 4 whites. We're gonna throw them out. Season it with cinnamon, nutmeg, ginger, clove, mace, salt, and then make it up into a strong batter with milk. Beat it well together. Put in half a pint of sack. That's a sort of like a sherry wine, so we're gonna get a little wine flavor in there. Make it so thin that it may run in your pan as you please. I guess however you like to make pancakes. Put your pan in the fire with a little butter or suet. When it is very hot, take a cloth and wipe it out. So to make your pan very clean. Then put in your butter, run it very thin, supply it with little bits of butter, toss it so often, bake it up crisp and brown. My mouth is watering already. We're starting off with our eggs. I got 4 whole eggs cracked into this bowl. We're gonna make the whole recipe. Usually I cut these down, but let's do it, right? So 4 eggs, because I want to eat all these pancakes. 4 eggs in the bowl. Now we're gonna do just some yolks, as they say in here, casting out the white, which is not how we would say it, right? But so we want just the yolks. So let me separate out a couple of yolks here. We don't maybe have to make it quite as rich as they would have, but that's okay. So let's go ahead and add some flour into this. We want to make sure that we don't add so much that, you know, we're overwhelming the liquid of the eggs. And maybe we should just plain add all the liquid ingredients in at this point. So we need some milk. That sort of gets added until we get to the right consistency. But we also put in this half a pint of our wine sack wine in this case. You can use any wine that you think's appropriate. And if you don't want to use wine at all, you can just go ahead and add extra milk. So I've finally gotten this batter kind of in shape, exactly kind of like I like to do pancakes, which is really sort of implied there. Now, this is very spicy, and in the time period, these would have been high-end pancakes. Let me tell you, we got lots of rich eggs in here, we've got wine in this, and then we have these expensive spices that are all gonna get put together here. We get a choice, and in the time period, the more spice we put in, the richer these pancakes are going to be, and it's the way you would show off to your guests just how rich you were, right? So we are so lucky today, aren't we? These spices are very, very inexpensive compared to what they were in the 18th century. The reason why they're always using nutmeg is because it was very expensive. So it is showing off. We get to show off just like they did. We can put as much spice in this as we want. So I'm gonna have fun. I love spicy pancakes. I love to experiment with the flavor of pancakes because it's something that's so easy to do. And maybe at the chagrin of some of my family members that might not like their pancakes quite so spicy. So we've got some salt in here. Now, we could have added this to the flour, but it doesn't give us a chance to test what's happening with these spices. So I'm gonna mix some of these in. I'm gonna get a kind of a equally guess as I go in, maybe half a teaspoon here, which might seem a bit much, but let's try it out. And then we get a chance to taste a little bit of this batter. I know raw eggs will probably kill you. You'll be all right, I promise you. We'll taste a little bit of these guys, and then we'll see if we need any more or if we need to adjust the balance. I'm not gonna go heavy on cloves. That's a bit much. Oh, the mace, yeah. And again, we want nice, finely ground spices. We don't have a hard time getting that today, but in the time period, they would have spent a good amount of time just preparing these spices. Ginger. I think this one we forget more than we ought to. I think this is another kind of like hidden, like nutmeg is. Ginger was used to spice things up in the 18th century because it was one of the less expensive ones. So we can go a little bit heavier on ginger if we want, especially to get that 18th century flavor. And don't forget the nutmeg. You got to have the nutmeg in there. This is just for the cook to do. Don't serve this to anybody else, obviously. Let's just get a little taste to make sure we're going the right place. We can go further. We have not gone far enough. I'm definitely. So a little more mace. This is the clove. No, not more clove. Nutmeg. There's a lot here, so you can definitely ginger. And if these things are missing the salt, it's definitely an issue too. So I'm gonna definitely go a little bit more salt there. Now it's really starting to smell and look like we want it to look. I'm gonna add just a touch more milk. This is a fairly big batch. As you're cooking, this batter is gonna slowly thicken up a little bit. So you wanna start just on the runny side so that it thickens up to right where you want it to be. And if you have to, halfway through the batch, just add a little bit of milk, you can do that. Now it's time to get that pan ready. So let's get that done. Our finished stack of pancakes, and hey, they smell good, that's for sure. They don't say it in the recipe, but very typically in these circumstances, in these 18th century recipes, what goes on pancakes at least in England in the 18th century, is lemon and sugar, not what we would do here in Indiana, which would be maple syrup. That's a very North American kind of thing. So I'm gonna stick with the typical thing going on here. A little bit of lemon juice, a little bit of sugar sprinkled up on top, and then I'm gonna give this a try. And wait, hold on. There. Now we're ready to try this guy out. I'm excited to see, because I've never done one with this many spices, and it smells heavenly. Now, you may not have done pancakes with lemon. It is really good. I would do it more often. If you've never tried it, definitely try it out. A little bit of sugar up on top, because it hasn't melted, even gives us a little kind of crunch. Another thing about these pancakes is they are very 18th century pancakes, not American pancakes that are all light and fluffy with lots of baking soda, baking powder in there to fluff them up. No, these are flat like crepes, very flat, but I like them better. They're a little more toothy, and I enjoy them. Wonderful spice, wonderful mix. I'm gonna make these like this all the time. I'm used to campfires in the fall. I'm used to pumpkin spice, and that's what we got, right? We got this wonderful wood smoke, and we got this time of year, and the crunchy leaves, and this wonderful pumpkin spice, and these just great pancakes. It all comes together. It feels like they all fit together, just like a puzzle. And I really encourage you to try out this wonderful recipe, and don't skimp on the spices, especially the nutmeg. It's almost Christmas, and what's more quintessentially Christmas than gingerbread? That's what we're going to be covering in this episode. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. So gingerbread has this amazing rich history. It goes back centuries, certainly well into the Middle Ages. And in that time period, gingerbread wasn't just a simple treat that you would serve your family. It was a very, very expensive thing, sometimes thought of as something a bit more medicinal. The ingredients were very medicinal. In that time period, it was full of very, very expensive spices that came from overseas, as well as an expensive sweetening agent. Usually something like honey was used in those very early gingerbreads. In fact, they're really nothing like what we think of as gingerbread today. Here's a recipe from the 18th century that is a very 17th century style gingerbread, and it's almost gummy and gooey. You don't bake it at all. You just sort of cook it and let it harden. Made with breadcrumbs and very, very spicy. This one has lots of wine in it, and it has brandy in it. It is an amazing recipe, but it's not something that really shows up too much by the time we get to the 18th century. Now, in the 18th century, gingerbread becomes more of a common thing. The molasses that gingerbread is made with is a very inexpensive sweetener. And ginger, by the time we get to the 18th century, becomes a very, very inexpensive spice. So it's gone from something that's really, really expensive to something that you could serve to anyone, any, economic level person. It would be sold on the street by street vendors, and people would go around selling it to children. So it's a really interesting evolution that gingerbread goes through. And in the 18th century, gingerbread's probably a little different than the kind of gingerbread we think of today. Most of the gingerbread recipes are a very hard cookie. By the time we get to the 19th century, well, those recipes change and gingerbread gets to be much softer, almost like a bread. So today we're going from Hannah Glass's cookbook. She is probably the most popular English cookbook author of our whole 18th century time period, and she's got several different gingerbread recipes. We're going to go with the one that is to make gingerbread cakes. So cake is just a little cookie-like item here. The recipe reads like this. Take 3 pounds of flour, 1 pound of sugar, 1 pound of butter rubbed in very fine, 2 ounces of ginger beat fine, a large nutmeg grated, then take a pound of treacle, 1/4 of a pint of cream, and make them warm together. And make up the bread stiff. Roll it out, make it up into thin cakes, cut them out with a teacup or a small glass, or roll them round like nuts, and bake them on tin plates in a slack oven. So we don't have a lot of ingredients here. Our spices are just ginger and nutmeg, what you would normally expect. Now, some of the real fancy recipes are going to include cinnamon and cloves and mace and whatever. This seems like the whole, spice cabinet gets tossed into some of these fancy ones, but this is a lot more typical. We start off with 3 pounds of flour. Let's get the sugar and the butter together. We're gonna do a 1/3 recipe on this. So we're gonna cut all our measurements down by 1/3. We take 1 pound of flour, and I would just use an all-purpose flour here. If we were trying to replicate a street gingerbread, well, maybe we would use a whole wheat flour. But in this case, all-purpose flour, 1 pound. To that, we're gonna add 1/3 of a pound of sugar. That's about 5.5 ounces or so. And we just use regular granulated sugar, dump that up on top and mix it. After that, in goes our butter. And again, we're using a 1/3 of a pound of butter. And we're gonna rub this in, just like we were doing a pie crust. Once we've got this mostly mixed in, it's time for our spices. We've got our main spice, which is ginger. And the recipe calls for 2 ounces, so we're gonna use about 1/3 of that, so a little less than 1 ounce. That's a lot of ginger, let me tell you. But I like ginger. Sometimes if you add too much, it can get a little bitter, so you might wanna try just a 1/2 ounce. And you can taste the batter when we're done, and maybe add a little bit more if you need a little bit more ginger. So we've got a little bit more than 1 ounce, or about 1 ounce of ginger here. And then, of course, we want nutmeg. And we're gonna use about 1/3 of a nutmeg. It's not a lot of nutmeg, but that'll add just that little bit. Give it the perfect 18th century flavor because nutmeg's in everything. Let's move on to the wet ingredients. We've got molasses and cream. And we're gonna take those, put them together, and warm them up. That'll make it mix so much easier. Now, the recipe calls for treacle. And treacle in the 18th century, as far as I can tell, is basically our standard molasses. So we're just using a typical molasses that you would get at the store. There's our molasses, and then our cream. Again, this is the 1/3 equivalent is 2 tablespoons of cream. Let's just put this over the fire for a little bit. Really, we're just warming these up to get them thin. This is your chance to be as creative as you want. While you're cutting these out, they made them in little squares, different sorts of geometric shapes. We're gonna make a few gingerbread men, and yes, they did do gingerbread men. So these are ready to go into the oven, 300 and let's say 25 degrees. And we want these to bake kind of hard. We don't expect them to fluff up. So they're probably gonna be a half hour in the oven. Our gingerbread is out of the oven and it smells so good. Now, we could let it cool and put decorations on them, and they did that. They gilt the gingerbread. They might put little designs on it. They might put letters on it so children can learn their ABCs. All sorts of things were done with gingerbread. But many times it was sold on the street warmed up in the wintertime. So they would have these stands and they would cook it and you would eat it when it's still warm. This is still warm. Let's give it a try. And let me tell you, it does smell really good. Since it's warm, it's still soft. Perfect texture. Even though there's no leavening in this, it still has a very, very nice texture. It's not too dense, which is something that you kind of worry about. If it cools, it'll get pretty hard and it'll get snappy like a cracker. But when it's warmed up, so good. And it's very gingery, let me tell you. This ginger it really takes over the whole thing. There's a reason why you don't need to put in a lot of the other spices, because the ginger will come right up to the top. So super gingery. Some people might think it's a little too gingery. I think that's the point of gingerbread. Let's make it gingery. This one's really, really good. It's got about the right amount for me. And the right kind of sweetness, not too much. It's got sugar and molasses in it. That balances it out. If it's just molasses, you get too much molasses flavor. This one's balanced really well. I've tried a couple different recipes from the 18th century. This one is one of the best. And I'm really excited about how this particular one turned out. I've got here the 17th century gingerbread to try out too. It's not really like bread, like we would call it bread at all. It's a lot more like a candy. This is made with boiling, a red port wine, and then you add in all this sugar and make a syrup, and then you add in breadcrumbs, and then a little bit of brandy, and then boil that a little bit, and then add more breadcrumbs until it turns into this consistency. This is fairly fresh, so it's still pliable. In the 17th century, they would let this dry and get harder, but it's got a bit more of a candy flavor to it. Even though it's got about the same amount of ginger for the quantity, in this other form, it's really good. I've made it sometimes before with different recipes and it didn't turn out. This one, though, it's not anything like what we would consider gingerbread. It's very, very good. I love digging into these recipes that are different than what we're sort of used to today. And digging into the history of foods where we can really see the roots as they go back and how the recipe changes, how the food changes. I'm really excited about this particular one because it's a little different than our standard gingerbread, but so good.